Hey everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know a lot of you use this video to fall asleep, so before we start, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you from and what time is it there? Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and just relax. The night shift at the storage facility. I've been working at a self-storage facility for about 3 years now. It's one of those massive places with hundreds of units spread across multiple buildings. The pay is decent and the work is easy. Most of my shift involves sitting in the office watching security monitors and doing a patrol every couple of hours. I work the night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Usually it's just me in the silence. Sometimes I'll get a late night customer who needs to grab something from their unit, but that's rare. Most people don't want to visit a storage facility in the middle of the night. This happened about 6 months ago during winter. It was a particularly cold night, and I remember the heater in the office was working overtime. I was about 2 hours into my shift when I noticed something odd on one of the monitors. Our facility has this policy where customers need to use their access code to enter after hours. The gate records every entry and exit. But I noticed movement in Building C on the cameras, even though nobody had entered through the main gate. I figured maybe someone had stayed past closing time. It happens sometimes. People get caught up organizing their stuff and don't realize how late it's gotten. So I decided to go check it out. Building C is the furthest from the office. It's this long structure with climate-controlled units. The hallways are narrow and the fluorescent lights flicker sometimes. I grabbed my flashlight even though the building lights were on. As I walked through the entrance, I called out, "Hello? The facility is closed. You need to leave." No response. I walked down the main hallway, checking each row. The place was dead quiet except for the hum of the climate control system. I was about halfway through the building when I heard it, the distinct sound of a metal door rolling up. Storage unit doors make this specific grinding noise when they open. If you've ever used one, you know exactly what I mean. The sound echoed through the hallway. I picked up my pace and headed toward the noise. It came from row F, near the back of the building. When I turned the corner, I saw unit F47 was open. The door was rolled all the way up and the light inside was on. This was strange for two reasons. First, nobody was supposed to be here. Second, the units don't have lights inside them. Customers bring their own flashlights or work lamps if they need light. I approached slowly, my hand on my radio ready to call for backup if needed. When I got to the unit and looked inside, what I saw made no sense. The unit was set up like a small room. There was a camping cot against one wall with blankets and a pillow. A battery-powered lantern sat on a small folding table. Empty food containers and water bottles were stacked in the corner. Someone had been living in this storage unit. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The walls were covered in photographs. Hundreds of them. All printed on regular paper and taped up. As I stepped closer to look, my blood ran cold. They were all pictures of the same woman. Some looked like they were taken from far away with a zoom lens. Others were closer, like they were shot from across a street or through a window. In some photos, she was at a grocery store. In others, she was walking to her car or sitting in a coffee shop. She had no idea she was being photographed. In the center of the back wall was a larger collection of photos arranged in a timeline. They showed her daily routine. Leaving her house at 7:45 a.m. Arriving at work at 8:15 a.m. Lunch break at 12:30 p.m. Leaving work at 5 p.m. Everything was documented. I backed out of the unit and immediately called the police. While waiting for them to arrive, I went back to the office to check our records. Unit F47 was rented to a John Smith, who had paid cash for 6 months up front. The address he provided was fake. The security footage showed him entering the facility during business hours and never leaving. He must have found a way to hide somewhere until after closing, then set up his living space. The police took this very seriously. They collected all the photographs and tried to identify the woman in them. It took a few days, but they found her. She lived about 3 miles from the storage facility and worked at a bank downtown. She had no idea she was being stalked. The really disturbing part came next. When the police searched the rest of the unit more carefully, they found a journal hidden under the cot. I wasn't allowed to read it, but the detective told me it contained detailed plans. The stalker was planning to kidnap her. He had been studying her routine for months, looking for the perfect opportunity. They never caught him. When the police arrived that night, he was already gone. He must have been somewhere in the facility when I discovered his setup. Maybe hiding in another unit or in one of the bathroom facilities. He left everything behind and disappeared. The woman he was stalking had to move. She quit her job and left the state. I don't blame her. How do you feel safe when someone has been watching your every move for months? We changed all our security procedures after that. Now we do a complete sweep of the facility at closing time. We installed more cameras and motion sensors. Every unit gets inspected monthly, even if the renter is up to date on payments. But I still think about that night. When I do my patrols now, I wonder if he's out there somewhere, setting up in another storage facility, watching another unsuspecting woman. The detective told me something that stuck with me. He said stalkers like this rarely stop on their own. They just find new targets and get better at not being caught. Sometimes during my shift, I'll see movement on the cameras that turns out to be nothing. Just shadows or a plastic bag blown by the wind. But for a moment, my heart races and I think he's come back. I've started carrying pepper spray on my patrols. The company doesn't officially allow it, but I don't care. If I ever run into him or someone like him again, I want to be prepared. The woman from the photos sent a thank you card to the facility about a month after everything happened. She said if I hadn't found that unit when I did, she doesn't know what would have happened to her. The detective told her the stalker's plans were detailed and well thought out. He had been waiting for the perfect moment. I keep that card in my desk drawer. On quiet nights when I'm alone in the office, I'll take it out and read it. It reminds me that my job isn't just about watching empty buildings. Sometimes, without even knowing it, we end up protecting people. But it also reminds me that there are people out there who use these anonymous spaces for dark purposes. Storage facilities are perfect for someone who wants to hide something, or hide themselves. I've been doing this job for 3 years, and that night changed how I see everything. Every new customer who pays in cash makes me suspicious. Every unit that hasn't been accessed in months makes me wonder what might be inside. The company offered to transfer me to a day shift after what happened. They thought I might be traumatized or scared to work nights. But I turned them down. If there's another person out there using our facility for something sinister, I want to be the one who finds them. Plus, the night shift pays better and I've got bills to pay. Still, some nights are harder than others. When it's quiet and I'm doing my patrol through Building C, I can't help but remember the sound of that rolling door, the photos on the wall, the realization that someone had been living there. I always check Unit F47 now, even though it's been rented to a nice elderly couple who store their RV there during winter. It's become part of my routine. Walk by, shine my flashlight through the gap at the bottom of the door, listen for any sounds. Just making sure history doesn't repeat itself. The library after dark. Working at a public library sounds like a dream job to most people. It's quiet, surrounded by books, and generally peaceful. I thought the same thing when I started 5 years ago. For the most part, it's true. But libraries, especially old ones, have their dark moments. Our library was built in 1923. It's this massive stone building with 3 floors and a basement that houses the archives. During the day, it's beautiful. Sunlight streams through the tall windows and the place feels warm and inviting. At night, it's different. I usually work the closing shift. We'd shut the doors at 8 p.m., but staff stayed until 9 to clean up and prepare for the next day. Most nights, there were 3 or 4 of us finishing up together. But on Wednesdays, due to scheduling, it was just me and one other person. This particular Wednesday was in late fall. My coworker Sarah had called in sick, so I was alone for the closing shift. It didn't bother me. I'd done it before. Lock the doors, do a sweep to make sure no one was hiding in the stacks, turn off the lights, set the alarm, and go home. I locked the front doors at exactly 8 p.m. and made the announcement over the intercom that the library was closed. Then I started my rounds. The first floor was clear. I checked between all the shelves, looked in the study rooms, and even checked the bathrooms. Everything was normal. The second floor was also empty. Just rows and rows of books in the dim emergency lighting. The third floor is where things got weird. Our third floor is the reference section. It's quieter than the other floors because it's mostly encyclopedias, academic journals, and other materials that don't circulate. The ceiling is lower up there and the shelves are packed tighter together. As I walked through the stacks, I heard breathing. Not my own breathing. This was heavier, raspier. It was coming from somewhere among the shelves, but the echo made it hard to pinpoint where. I stopped walking and listened. The breathing continued, slow and deliberate. "Hello?" I called out. "The library is closed. You need to leave." The breathing stopped immediately. I stood there for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, just waiting, listening. Nothing but silence. I convinced myself I was imagining things. Old buildings make weird noises. The ventilation system, pipes expanding and contracting, whatever. I continued my sweep, checking each row methodically. That's when I saw him. At the very back of the floor, tucked between two shelves, was a man. He was standing perfectly still, facing the books. His hands were at his sides and his head was tilted at an odd angle, like he was reading the spines but in an unnatural position. "Sir?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The library is closed." He didn't move, didn't acknowledge me at all. I took a step closer. "Sir, I need you to leave now." Still nothing. Something felt very wrong. Every instinct told me not to get closer, but I had a job to do. I pulled out my phone, ready to call security if needed, and approached. When I was about 10 feet away, he suddenly turned his head toward me. Just his head. His body stayed facing the shelves. The movement was so unnatural it made me take a step back. His eyes were wide open, unblinking. His mouth hung slightly open, and I could hear that raspy breathing again. But the worst part was his expression, or lack of one. His face was completely blank, like he was sleepwalking. "Are you okay?" I asked, genuinely concerned now. Maybe he was having some kind of medical episode. He turned his body to face me, moving in this jerky, uncoordinated way. Then he started walking toward me. Not running, just walking with these strange, shuffling steps. I backed up quickly. "Stay back. I'm calling security." He kept coming. I turned and ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. Something about the way he moved, the blank stare, the weird breathing, it triggered every flight response in my body. I ran down the stairs, taking them two at a time. Behind me, I could hear his footsteps, that shuffling gait echoing in the stairwell. I burst through the door onto the second floor and ran toward the elevator. The elevator in our library is old and slow. I jammed the button repeatedly, looking back at the stairwell door. It opened just as the elevator arrived. I jumped in and hit the button for the first floor. As the doors were closing, I saw him emerge from the stairwell. He stood there, staring at me with those blank eyes, breathing heavily. The doors shut and the elevator began its slow descent. When I reached the first floor, I ran to the front desk and called 911. I told them someone was in the library who wouldn't leave and was acting strangely. They said they'd send someone right away. I waited by the front doors, ready to run outside if needed. I kept glancing at the stairs and elevator, expecting him to appear at any moment. But he never came down. The police arrived within 10 minutes. 2 officers entered while I waited outside. They searched the entire building, all 3 floors and the basement. They found no one. They checked the security cameras. The footage showed me doing my rounds, but there was no sign of the man. The cameras have some blind spots, especially on the 3rd floor where the shelves create shadows, but he should have been visible at some point. The officers were professional but skeptical. They probably thought I was overworked or had imagined the whole thing. They did a final sweep with me and we found one disturbing detail. In the spot where I'd first seen him, several books had been pulled partially out of the shelf. They were all medical texts about sleep disorders. One was open on the floor to a chapter about somnambulism, sleepwalking. The police took a report, but there wasn't much they could do. No crime had been committed. The man, if he existed, was gone. I finished closing the library with one of the officers keeping me company. When I finally left around 10:30 p.m., I was exhausted and shaken. The next few weeks were tense. I never worked alone again, I made sure of that. Sarah or another coworker was always there for the closing shift. We instituted a new policy where 2 people had to do the final sweep together. About a month later, I was shelving books on the 3rd floor during the day when a patron approached me. She was an older woman, probably in her 70s. "In planning?" "Excuse me," she said. "I'm looking for books about sleep disorders. My nephew has been having terrible problems." I showed her to the medical section, the same area where I'd encountered the strange man. As she browsed, she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "He's been sleepwalking terribly," she said. "Sometimes he leaves the house and we find him in the strangest places. Last month, the police found him in the park at 3 a.m. He had no memory of how he got there." I asked her to describe her nephew. My heart sank as she detailed someone who matched the man I'd seen. The same age, same build, same vacant expression she'd witnessed during his episodes. Has he ever come to the library? I asked, trying to sound casual. She thought for a moment. You know, he mentioned once that he felt drawn to libraries, said they felt safe to him. But he usually comes during the day when I can accompany him. I helped her find the books she needed and didn't mention my encounter. What would be the point? But it got me thinking. If he was sleepwalking, how did he get into the library? All the doors were locked. I checked them myself. The only explanation was that he'd been in the building all day, hidden somewhere until after closing. I went back and reviewed our security footage from that day. Hours of footage from multiple cameras. And then I found him. Or at least I think I did. At 3:47 p.m., there's a brief moment where someone walks past one of the third-floor cameras. They're moving normally, not shuffling. They disappear into the blind spot between shelves. That's the only glimpse. He must have hidden there for over 4 hours, waiting. But waiting for what? And if he was awake when he hid, when did the sleepwalking episode begin? I've researched sleepwalking extensively since then. Most episodes last 5 to 15 minutes. But there are rare cases where people can perform complex actions for hours while technically asleep. They can even hold conversations, though they rarely make sense. The library feels different to me now. During the day, it's still the peaceful place I love. But as closing time approaches, I get anxious. I find myself checking the third floor more carefully, looking in every possible hiding spot. Sometimes I think about that man wandering in his sleep, drawn to the library for reasons even he doesn't understand. Is he still out there? Does he still feel that pull to come back? We've increased security since then. More cameras, better coverage, regular security patrols. But old buildings like this have so many hidden corners, so many places someone could hide if they really wanted to. I still work here. Still love my job despite what happened. But I'll never work alone again. And I'll never forget that blank stare, that raspy breathing, that shuffling walk. Libraries are supposed to be sanctuaries of knowledge and learning. Safe spaces for everyone. But safety is relative, isn't it? And knowledge? Well, sometimes ignorance might be more comfortable. Every time I shelve books in the medical section, I check those sleep disorder texts, making sure they're all there, making sure none have been disturbed. It's become a compulsion, a ritual that makes me feel safer. But deep down, I know that if he wants to come back, if something draws him here in his sleep, a few security cameras won't stop him. You can't reason with someone who isn't really awake. You can't explain that the library is closed to someone whose conscious mind is dormant. All you can do is run. The midnight delivery route. I've been delivering packages for a major shipping company for about 7 years. It's good work, decent pay, benefits, and I like being on the road. Most people don't know this, but we have drivers who work the overnight shift, delivering to businesses and special priority packages. That's what I do. My route takes me through industrial areas, office parks, and sometimes residential neighborhoods. I usually start at 10 p.m. and finish around 6 a.m. It's quiet work. Most deliveries are left at loading docks or in secure drop boxes. I rarely see anyone. This happened last spring. I was about halfway through my route, sometime around 2 a.m. I had a delivery for a business in this old industrial complex on the outskirts of town. The kind of place that used to be thriving but now mostly has empty warehouses and a few struggling companies hanging on. The address was for Unit 47B in Building 7. I'd never delivered there before, which was unusual. After 7 years, I knew most of the businesses on my routes. But companies move in and out of these old complexes all the time. I pulled up to Building 7 and checked my manifest. The package was marked Priority Overnight Signature Required. That was weird. Who would be there to sign for a package at 2 a.m.? But mine wasn't to question why. I grabbed the package, a small box about the size of a shoebox, and headed to the entrance. The building was mostly dark except for a few security lights. I found Unit 47B down a long hallway. Light was coming from under the door. I knocked. Delivery. The door opened immediately, like someone had been standing right behind it waiting. A woman peered out. She was probably in her 40s, wearing what looked like medical scrubs. Her eyes darted nervously past me into the hallway. Package 4. I checked my scanner. Dr. Elizabeth Chin? Yes, that's me. She reached for the package, but I pulled it back. I need a signature. She seemed frustrated but took my scanner and signed quickly. Her hands were shaking. As she handed it back, I noticed dark stains on her scrubs. Could have been anything, but it looked like blood. "Thank you," she said and started to close the door. That's when I heard it. From somewhere inside the unit came a sound I'll never forget. It was like a moan but different. Faint, desperate, human but somehow not quite. The woman's eyes widened. She slammed the door shut and I heard multiple locks engaging. I stood there for a moment, unsure what to do. Every instinct told me something was very wrong. But I had more deliveries to make and technically my job was done. I walked back to my truck, but that sound kept replaying in my head. As I was logging the delivery, I noticed something odd on the manifest. The sender was listed as Met Supply International, but the return address was residential, not commercial. I finished my route that night, but I couldn't stop thinking about that delivery. The woman's nervousness, the stains on her clothes, that horrible sound. 2 nights later, I had another delivery for the same address. Same priority overnight, signature required. Same small box from the same suspicious sender. This time I was prepared to pay more attention. I parked a little ways away and approached on foot. As I got closer to Building 7, I noticed other vehicles there. 3 vans with tinted windows, no company logos. I delivered the package. Same woman answered, same nervous behavior. But this time when she opened the door, I caught a glimpse inside. The unit had been converted into some kind of medical facility. I saw steel tables, bright lights, and what looked like surgical equipment. And I heard that sound again. Actually, multiple sounds. More than one voice making those horrible noises. The woman noticed me looking and quickly blocked my view. She practically ripped the scanner from my hand, signed, and slammed the door. I sat in my truck afterward, debating what to do. Call the police? Report it to my supervisor? But report what exactly? That a woman in medical scrubs was receiving packages at odd hours? That I heard strange noises? None of that was illegal. Over the next month, I delivered to that address at least twice a week. Always the same type of packages. Always the same woman answering, though sometimes there were other people in scrubs visible in the background. I started paying attention to details. The packages were always light but marked fragile medical supplies. The vans were there most nights, sometimes different ones. And those sounds, they never stopped. Sometimes louder, sometimes quieter, but always there. One night, I arrived earlier than usual, around 1:30 a.m. As I walked up to the building, I saw them loading something into one of the vans. It was wrapped in plastic sheeting and required 2 people to carry. They moved quickly, efficiently, like they'd done this many times before. They saw me coming and stopped. One of them, a large man in scrubs, walked toward me. "You're early," he said. It wasn't friendly. "Just delivering a package," I replied, trying to sound casual. He stared at me for a long moment. "Leave it by the door. We're busy. It requires a signature." His jaw tightened. "Wait here." He went inside and returned with Dr. Chin. She signed for the package without saying a word, but I noticed she kept glancing at the man, almost like she was afraid of him. After that night, things changed. The deliveries became more frequent, sometimes 2 in one night. The packages got heavier, and there were more people around, more vans coming and going. I knew I should report it, but to whom? And what would I say? I had no proof of anything illegal, just suspicions and bad feelings. Then came the night that changed everything. I arrived for a delivery around 3 a.m. The parking lot was empty except for one van. As I approached the door, I heard shouting from inside. An argument. Then a crash like equipment being knocked over. The door burst open and someone ran out. A young man, early 20s maybe, wearing nothing but hospital gown. He was barefoot, stumbling, clearly disoriented. He saw me and ran toward me. "Help me," he gasped. "Please, you have to help me." Before I could respond, 2 men in scrubs came running out after him. The young man tried to get past me, but he was weak, uncoordinated. The men caught him easily. "Sorry about this," one of them said to me as they dragged him back. "Patient with dementia. Keeps trying to escape." The young man looked at me with desperate eyes. "I'm not sick," he screamed. "They're keeping us here. They're dash." One of the men put a hand over his mouth, muffling his words. They pulled him inside and slammed the door. I stood there, package in hand, heart racing. That was no dementia patient. That young man was terrified and definitely being held against his will. I went back to my truck and called 911. Told them I'd witnessed what looked like a kidnapping. They said they'd send units to investigate. I waited in my truck watching. 20 minutes later, 2 police cars arrived. The officers went inside. They were in there for about an hour. When they came out, they didn't have anyone in custody. One of the officers approached my truck. He looked tired, annoyed. "You the one who called?" he asked. "Yes." "Did you find Dash?" "It's a private medical facility," he interrupted. "They're licensed." They showed us all the paperwork. They treat patients with severe mental health issues. The man you saw is a patient who frequently has episodes where he believes he's being held captive. It's part of his condition. But Dash, look, I get it. Probably looked scary. But everything checks out. They have all the proper permits and documentation. No crime has been committed here. He walked away and the police cars left. I sat there not knowing what to think. Was I wrong? Was it really just a medical facility treating difficult patients? But something nagged at me. If it was legitimate, why all the secrecy? Why deliver supplies in the middle of the night? Why did everyone there seem so nervous, so eager to keep people out? I kept delivering to that address for another 2 weeks. Each time I felt sick to my stomach. I couldn't forget that young man's face, his desperate plea for help. Then suddenly the delivery stopped. No more packages for Unit 47B. Curious, I drove by one night during my route. Building 7 was dark. The unit was empty, cleared out. No sign they'd ever been there. I checked with my dispatcher. The account had been closed. No forwarding address. It took some digging, but I eventually found a news article from a few weeks later. Police in another state had raided an illegal organ harvesting operation. The article mentioned they'd been operating out of various locations, moving frequently to avoid detection. The details were sparse, but one thing caught my eye. They mentioned recovering several victims who'd been kept sedated for weeks. Young, healthy people who'd been reported missing from various states. I never found out for certain if it was the same group. The article didn't mention Dr. Chin or provide photos of the suspects. But the timing was too coincidental. I think about that young man often. Did he escape? Was he one of the victims they recovered? Or was he? I try not to think about the alternative. I still deliver packages on the overnight shift. Still drive past that industrial complex sometimes. Building 7 stands empty now with for lease signs in the windows. But I never stop there. Never even slow down. Sometimes I wonder how many illegal operations use legitimate businesses like mine to move their supplies. How many drivers, thinking they're just doing their jobs, unknowingly help terrible people do terrible things. I'm more careful now. I pay attention to what I'm delivering, where it's going, who's receiving it. Maybe I'm paranoid. But if I ever see something like that again, I won't wait. I won't debate. I'll call the authorities immediately and keep calling until someone takes it seriously. That young man's face haunts me. His desperate plea for help. The way those men dragged him back inside. The way the police dismissed it all so easily. I was just a delivery driver doing my job. Following the rules. Making my drops and moving on. But sometimes following the rules isn't enough. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts, even if everyone tells you you're wrong. I'll never know for sure what was happening in Unit 47B, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that young man wasn't lying. He needed help and I failed him. We all did. The hotel night auditor. I've worked as a night auditor at hotels for almost a decade. For those who don't know, a night auditor is basically the person who runs the front desk overnight while also doing the accounting work. It's perfect for someone like me who's always been a night owl. The job is usually quiet. Check in a few late arrivals, deal with the occasional noise complaint, run the financial reports. Most nights, I spend more time reading or watching videos than actually working. That's the beauty of it. This story happened about 2 years ago when I was working at a mid-range hotel near the airport. It wasn't fancy, but it wasn't a dump either. Just a standard business hotel with 150 rooms spread over 6 floors. It was a Tuesday night in September. Slow season. We were only at about 30% occupancy, which meant most of the hotel was empty. I came in at 11 p.m. to relieve the evening shift and settled in for what I expected to be another boring night. Around 1 a.m., I got a call from room 312. Front desk, how can I help you? There's someone in my room. It was a woman's voice, whispering, terrified. I sat up straight. Someone's in your room? Are you safe? I'm in the bathroom. Door locked. Someone's in my room. I can hear them. I immediately checked our system. Room 312 was registered to Ms. Jennifer Walsh. Checked in that afternoon. Single occupancy. I'm calling the police right now, I told her. Stay on the line with me. I dialed 911 on another phone and quickly explained the situation. They said units were on the way. Meanwhile, I kept talking to Ms. Walsh. Are you still there? I asked. Yes, she whispered. They're moving around. I can hear drawers opening. The police are coming. Just stay quiet and keep the door locked. Wait, she said. It's quiet now. I don't hear anything. A long pause. I think they're gone, she said, sounding a bit relieved but still scared. Don't leave the bathroom yet, I warned. Wait for the police. Okay, she stopped mid-sentence. Ms. Walsh? The doorknob, she whispered, so quiet I could barely hear. Someone's trying the bathroom doorknob. My blood ran cold. The police are almost there. Don't make a sound. I heard a rattling sound through the phone. Then silence. Ms. Walsh? No response. Ms. Walsh, are you there? The line went dead. I grabbed our master key and ran for the elevator. I know I should have waited for the police, but I couldn't just sit there. As the elevator climbed, I called 911 again and told them I was heading to the room. The third floor was eerily quiet. Half the lights were off to save energy in the empty sections. I ran down the hallway to room 312 and knocked. Ms. Walsh? It's the front desk. The police are here. No answer. I used my master key and slowly opened the door. The room was dark. I flipped on the lights. Ms. Walsh? The room looked normal. Bed still made. Her suitcase open on the luggage rack. I moved toward the bathroom. The bathroom door was open. Inside, the shower curtain was pulled closed. With a shaking hand, I pulled it back. I searched the entire room. Under the bed, in the closet, behind the curtains. No sign of Ms. Walsh or anyone else. The police arrived minutes later. They did a thorough search of the room and found something disturbing. The window was unlocked and slightly open. We were on the third floor, but there was a narrow ledge that connected to the adjacent rooms. They searched the entire floor, then the entire hotel. No sign of Ms. Walsh or any intruder. Here's where it gets stranger. The police checked our security footage. We had cameras in all the hallways and elevators. The footage showed Ms. Walsh entering her room at 7 p.m. But there was no footage of her leaving. No footage of anyone else entering the room. They checked the room phone records. No call had been made to the front desk from room 312. According to all our systems, Jennifer Walsh had never called me. But I knew what I heard. I had spoken to her. She was terrified. Someone was in her room. The police treated it as a missing person case. They found Ms. Walsh's car in our parking lot, her belongings still in the room. Her cell phone was on the nightstand. Her purse with wallet and ID on the dresser. They interviewed me multiple times. I told them exactly what happened, but without any record of the phone call, they seemed skeptical. They suggested maybe I had dozed off and dreamed it, or that someone had prank called me. But I knew better. You don't forget a voice that terrified. You don't imagine that kind of fear. The investigation went nowhere. Jennifer Walsh had simply vanished. No body was ever found. No ransom demands. Her family was devastated. The case went cold. I couldn't let it go. I started doing my own research, looking into the hotel's history. What I found made me sick. In 1997, a woman named Margaret Chen had stayed in room 312. She called the front desk in the middle of the night reporting an intruder. By the time security got to her room, she was gone. Never found. In 2003, another woman, Lisa Patterson, room 312. Same story. Late night call about someone in her room. Vanished without a trace. In 2009, Sarah Martinez, room 312. Called about an intruder. Never seen again. Always women traveling alone. Always room 312. Always calling about an intruder that no one else ever saw. And always no record of the phone calls in the hotel system. I brought this information to the police. They were interested but said it could be coincidence. The hotel had been operating for over 40 years. In that time, thousands of people had stayed in room 312. 4 missing persons cases could be statistical chance. But I knew better. I started digging deeper. I found old employee records, interviewed former workers. That's when I met Harold, a maintenance worker who'd been at the hotel in the 90s. Room 312, he said when I mentioned it. Yeah, I remember. We used to have problems with that room. What kind of problems? He looked uncomfortable. Guests would complain about noises, feeling watched. Some would check out in the middle of the night, demanding a different room. Management eventually stopped booking it for a while. Why didn't they just renovate it? They did, multiple times. New furniture, new carpet, even changed the layout. Nothing helped. Bad things happened in that room. What kind of bad things? He was quiet for a moment. You ever hear about the hotel before it was a hotel? I shook my head. Used to be an apartment building back in the 60s. Budget place. Had a lot of problems. There was this maintenance guy who worked there. Had keys to all the apartments. My skin started to crawl. He would let himself into apartments at night. Watch women while they slept. Sometimes he'd take things. Souvenirs. Most people never knew. But one night, a woman woke up and caught him. What happened? She screamed. Tried to call for help. He panicked. By the time anyone responded, she was gone. He'd taken her. They caught him? Harold nodded. Eventually. But not before he'd taken 3 more women. Always the same way. They'd wake up, find him in their room, and then gone. What apartment was this? 3rd floor, unit 12. When they converted to a hotel, it became room 312. I felt sick. What happened to him? The maintenance man? Died in prison in the 80s. But here's the thing, they never found the bodies. Those 4 women were never found. I quit that job the next week. I couldn't work there anymore, couldn't walk past room 312 without thinking about Jennifer Walsh and all the women before her. The hotel still operates. Room 312 is still available for booking. I've checked. They've even renovated again recently based on the photos online. It looks like any other room. Sometimes I think about calling them, warning them. But what would I say? That their hotel room is haunted? That women disappear from it? They'd think I was crazy that I found another night audit job at a different hotel across town. It's newer, no history, no room 312. But sometimes, late at night when the phone rings, I hesitate before answering. Afraid I'll hear another terrified woman's voice. Afraid I'll have to listen as someone else vanishes into whatever horror exists in that room. I still think about Jennifer Walsh. Her family still searches for her. They have a Facebook page sharing her photo, begging for information. I've never told them about my research about the other women. What good would it do? It would just add to their pain. But I know the truth. Something in room 312 takes women. It's been doing it for decades. Maybe it's the ghost of that maintenance man, still using his keys, still taking women in the night. Or maybe it's something else, something that was there even before him. The hotel industry doesn't talk about things like this. Bad for business. Every old hotel has its stories, its problem rooms. We just clean them up, rent them out, and hope for the best. If you're ever traveling alone, especially if you're a woman, and they try to give you room 312, ask for a different room. Make up an excuse. Say you don't like the number. Say you prefer a different floor. Just don't stay in room 312. And if you do, if you have no choice and you wake up in the middle of the night to find someone in your room, don't call the front desk. Don't hide in the bathroom. Run. Get out. Because once you make that call, once you hide and wait for help, you become part of the pattern. You become another woman who vanished from room 312. I sometimes wonder if Jennifer Walsh is still alive somewhere. If all those women are. But I don't think so. I think whatever takes them doesn't keep them. I think room 312 is a trap, and once it closes, there's no escape. The worst part is knowing it will happen again. Some night, some woman traveling alone will check into room 312. She'll go to sleep thinking she's safe. She'll wake to find someone in her room. She'll call for help that will arrive too late. And another name will be added to the list of women who vanished without a trace. The parking garage security guard. I worked security for a downtown parking garage for 4 years. It's not glamorous work, but it paid well enough, and honestly it was usually pretty easy. I'd sit in the booth, watch the monitors, do hourly rounds, and make sure nobody was breaking into cars. The garage was 8 stories tall, connected to an office building that mostly emptied out by 6 p.m. My shift ran from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. After about 8 p.m. the place was like a ghost town. Just me, the empty cars, and the humming of the fluorescent lights. This happened during my 3rd year on a Thursday night in winter. It had been snowing earlier, so there were even fewer cars than usual. Maybe 30 vehicles scattered across all 8 levels. Around 11 p.m., I was doing my rounds on level 5 when I noticed something odd. There was a car I didn't recognize, an old sedan, maybe from the 90s. What caught my attention wasn't the car itself, but the fact that someone was sitting in it. That wasn't too unusual. Sometimes people would sit in their cars to make phone calls or eat dinner before heading home. But something about this felt different. The person wasn't moving, just sitting there in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead. I approached the car and tapped on the window with my flashlight. Security. Everything okay? No response. The person didn't even turn to look at me. I shined my light through the window. It was a woman, middle-aged, wearing a winter coat. Her hands were on the steering wheel, and she was staring at the concrete wall in front of her car. Her eyes were open, but there was something vacant about her expression. I knocked harder. "Ma'am? I need you to respond or I'll have to call for assistance." Nothing. I tried the door handle. Locked. I went around to the other side. Also locked. Through the windows, I could see the keys dangling from the ignition. I radioed back to the booth. Got a situation on level 5. Woman locked in her car, non-responsive. Might be a medical emergency. I called 911 and explained the situation. They said they'd send paramedics and police. While waiting, I kept trying to get the woman's attention. Knocking on windows, shining my light, even gently rocking the car. She never moved, never blinked, just kept staring at that wall. The paramedics arrived about 15 minutes later. They had to break the window to get in. As soon as they opened the door, the woman turned her head toward them. "Why did you do that?" she asked calmly, like breaking her window was just a minor inconvenience. The paramedics tried to assess her, asking if she was okay, if she knew where she was. She answered their questions but seemed confused about why they were there. "I'm waiting," she said. "Waiting for what?" one of them asked. She turned back to stare at the wall. "I don't know, but I'm supposed to wait here." They convinced her to get out of the car and took her to the hospital for evaluation. The police ran her plates. The car was registered to a Linda Patterson from the suburbs. They contacted her family. Here's where it gets weird. Linda Patterson had been missing for 3 days. Her family had filed a missing person report. She'd left for work Monday morning and never arrived. They'd been searching everywhere. But here's the thing, I'd been working every night that week. That car was not in the garage on Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. I would have noticed it during my rounds. It had somehow appeared on Thursday with Linda inside it. The police questioned me extensively. They reviewed all our security footage. The cameras showed Linda's car entering the garage at 3:47 a.m. on Thursday morning. She drove straight to level 5, parked in that spot, and then nothing. She just sat there for over 19 hours until I found her. But the entrance camera footage was the truly disturbing part. It showed her car entering, but Linda wasn't driving. The driver's seat appeared to be empty. The police thought it was a camera malfunction. Had to be. Cars don't drive themselves, especially not 90s sedans. But I saw that footage. The quality wasn't great, but it was clear enough. No one was driving that car. Linda was hospitalized for observation. Doctors found nothing physically wrong with her. But she had no memory of the missing 3 days. The last thing she remembered was leaving her house Monday morning. Then she was in the parking garage, knowing only that she was supposed to wait. I visited her in the hospital. I'm not sure why. I guess I felt connected to the situation. "Can you tell me anything about what happened?" I asked. She looked at me for a long moment. "I dream about it sometimes. Not memories, just impressions." "What kind of impressions?" "Dark rooms. Other people sitting in cars, all waiting like I was. And someone walking between the cars, checking on us." "Who?" "I don't know. But in the dreams, I'm terrified of them noticing me, of them realizing I'm aware." She grabbed my hand suddenly, her grip surprisingly strong. "There are others, still waiting, still sitting in their cars somewhere." She was released a few days later. The police couldn't hold her, she hadn't committed any crimes. The missing days remained a mystery. I went back to work, but I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Others still waiting. I started paying more attention during my rounds, checking every car, especially the ones that sat in the same spot day after day. About a month later, level 7. Another car with someone sitting inside, staring straight ahead. This time I didn't hesitate. I called 911 immediately. Robert Chin missing for 5 days. Same story. No memory of the missing time, just knew he was supposed to wait. His car had appeared overnight, Entrance footage showing an empty driver's seat. 2 months after that, level 3. Maria Santos missing for a week. Same situation exactly, then more. Over the next year, I found 6 people in total. All had been missing for days. All were sitting in their cars, staring, waiting. All their cars had somehow driven themselves into the garage. The police started taking it seriously. They set up a task force, investigated similar cases in other cities, found reports going back years. People vanishing, then being found days later in parking garages, sitting in their cars with no memory of what happened. Always parking garages. Never parking lots or street parking. Always multi-level garages. I couldn't take it anymore. The stress of walking those levels, wondering if I'd find another person, wondering what was taking them and why it was returning them to my garage. I quit last year, but I still follow the story. The task force hasn't made any progress. They've found more cases, created patterns and timelines, but no explanation. No suspects. No idea what's happening to these people during their missing days. Linda Patterson reached out to me a few months ago. She'd connected with other victims online. They called themselves The Returned. They meet once a month to share their dreams, their fragments of memory. She invited me to a meeting. I went curious. There were 12 of them in that room. All had the same story. Missing for days, found in parking garages, no memory. But they all shared similar dreams. Dark places, being stored like inventory, something checking on them. One man, Thomas, had the clearest memories. "I think we're being studied," he said. "Collected, like specimens." "By who?" someone asked. "Not who. What? In my dreams, the thing checking on us. It's not human. It's pretending to be human, but it's not." The room went quiet. Linda spoke up. "We all feel it, don't we? That we were taken somewhere else. Somewhere not here. And when they were done with us, they put us back. Left us in those garages like returned merchandise. They've tried hypnotherapy, regression therapy, everything to recover their memories. Nothing works. Whatever happened to them, their minds can't or won't remember. But they all share one thing, they're terrified of parking garages now. Won't go in them. Some won't even drive anymore. I think about it every time I see a parking garage. How many levels of how many garages have people sitting in cars, waiting? How many security guards will find them tonight, tomorrow, next week? And what happens to the ones who aren't found? Who sit there waiting until, what? Their families never report them missing? Their cars never get noticed? Sometimes late at night, I drive past my old garage. I don't go in, but I count the cars I can see through the open sides. Wonder if any of them have someone inside, sitting, staring, waiting. The official count is now over 200 cases nationwide. Those are just the ones they've found. The ones where someone noticed. Whatever is taking people, it's still out there. Still collecting. Still returning some of them to parking garages when it's done. If you ever see someone sitting in their car in a parking garage, not moving, just staring, check on them. Call for help. They might be one of the returned. Or worse, they might still be waiting for whatever took them to come back. And if you ever have missing time, if you ever can't account for days of your life, avoid parking garages. Whatever is happening, that's where it returns people. That's where the collection points are. I work mall security now. Single level. Open air. No parking garage. It pays less, but I sleep better. Most nights. The Memorial Park Night Guard. About 12 years ago, I worked at a memorial park. The pay was decent and the job was pretty straightforward. All I had to do was patrol the grounds in my golf cart and make sure nobody was trespassing after hours. Every night followed the same routine, and after a few months I'd gotten comfortable with the eerie atmosphere of the place. After a regular shift, I clocked out around 5 a.m. and drove home. I didn't usually sleep until around 10 or so, and while I was having breakfast at 9:30 my phone rang. It was my supervisor. He asked if I had noticed anything unusual during my shift, and I told him no because I hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary. He then informed me that a memorial had been vandalized. I insisted I hadn't seen anything, especially not any teenagers, which were usually responsible for these things. Anyway, he asked if I could come back to help assess the damage, and I agreed immediately because I felt somewhat responsible. When I arrived, I realized I had completely underestimated how bad the vandalism was. This wasn't just some spray paint or knocked over flowers. There was extensive damage to the memorial stone with offensive symbols and terrible words carved deep into the granite. What made it even worse was when we started cleaning and I could finally read whose memorial it was. I won't share the name for obvious reasons, but it was a young girl only 10 years old who had passed away just 2 months earlier. I felt this overwhelming mix of rage and sorrow. Who could do something like that to a child's memorial? I stayed with my supervisor for a while as we reviewed the security footage. The memorial park was large though, and we only had cameras at the main entrance and office building. They weren't high quality either. This was over a decade ago and the technology wasn't great. We couldn't see anyone in the footage. My supervisor contacted the police and the park management, and for the next 3 weeks they assigned additional security to patrol with me during the night shifts. Those weeks passed without any incidents. We didn't spot anyone suspicious or find any more vandalized memorials. One guard would patrol with me while another stayed at the entrance. I actually got along well with the guard who rode with me. We spent a lot of time discussing who might have done it, and after a while it seemed like we'd never find out. It appeared to be an isolated incident, as terrible as it was. Eventually the extra security was removed due to the lack of activity, and I was back to patrolling alone. Another week went by peacefully before something happened again. One night, as I had just begun my shift and started my patrol route, I drove all the way to the eastern section of the park, got out, and began walking to check the area more thoroughly, which I'd started doing after the vandalism. As I was approaching the area where the girl's memorial was located, something felt wrong. I was still about 100 yards away, and it was completely dark, but something seemed off. I stood there for maybe 20 seconds just staring into the darkness, feeling increasingly uneasy. I started walking closer while sweeping my flashlight across the grounds. When I was about 50 feet away, I aimed my flashlight toward the girl's memorial. The beam barely reached that far, and in the weak light I could make out a dark shape on the ground, completely motionless beside the memorial. Obviously I was terrified. I couldn't tell if it was a person lying there or something else entirely. I moved closer very slowly, and when I was maybe 20 or 30 feet away, I nearly jumped out of my skin as the figure suddenly leaped up and ran into the darkness between the memorials, disappearing completely within seconds. I stood frozen in shock and confusion. Once I collected myself, I ran back to the golf cart and immediately called the police on my radio. Then I went back to the girl's memorial. I need to warn you, what I found was deeply disturbing. In front of the memorial stone was a hole. It wasn't very large, clearly not made with proper tools, but looked like someone had been digging with their hands. It wasn't deep, maybe just 8 or 10 inches. But it was clear someone had been trying to dig down to the burial site with nothing but their bare hands, and it made me physically ill. I don't know what this person was trying to accomplish, and unfortunately we never discovered who was responsible, but I can tell you it never happened again. The park hired 3 permanent night guards, and one of us always kept watch specifically over that section while the others patrolled the rest of the grounds. Management also increased daytime security. To this day, that remains the most disturbing thing I've experienced working security. No supernatural encounters, no monsters, just a deeply disturbed human being. I left that job about a year later, not because of that incident, but because I found better paying work. However, I still think about that night sometimes. The image of that dark figure crouched by a child's grave digging with their hands is burned into my memory. I wonder what kind of person does something like that, what drives someone to such a horrible act. The girl's family never found out about the attempted grave disturbance. We all agreed it would only cause them more pain. They'd already been through enough losing their daughter. The memorial was repaired and looks beautiful now. I drove by there a few months ago during the day. Fresh flowers were placed by the stone, probably by her parents. But I know what happened there in the darkness. I know someone tried to violate that sacred space for reasons I'll never understand. Working night security teaches you that the real dangers aren't ghosts or demons. They're the people who use the cover of darkness to do terrible things most folks never imagine. After that experience, I always carried extra equipment during my patrols: pepper spray, a better flashlight, and a personal alarm. I never wanted to feel that vulnerable again. The other guards who worked there after the incident told me they'd sometimes see people standing at the edge of the property late at night, just watching, never entering but standing there in the shadows. We reported these sightings to police, but without any crime being committed, there wasn't much they could do. The person or people would always leave before officers arrived. I often wonder if it was the same individual who had vandalized the memorial and tried to dig it up. Were they returning to finish what they started, or were they just drawn back to the scene for some sick reason? One of the other guards had a theory that made my skin crawl. He thought maybe the person knew the family somehow, maybe they had some twisted connection to the child that made them target her memorial specifically. We never found evidence to support that theory, but it haunted me the idea that this wasn't random, that someone had chosen that particular child's resting place for a reason. I remember one night about a month after the incident, I was patrolling that section and found a small toy left by the memorial, a little stuffed elephant, worn and dirty like it had been loved for years. It could have been left by the family, but something about it felt wrong, the way it was positioned facing away from the memorial toward the darkness where the figure had fled that night. I photographed it and reported it, but left it there in case it was from the parents. When I came back the next night, it was gone. Small things like that kept happening, items appearing and disappearing, strange marks in the dirt that could have been footprints or could have been animals, we never knew for sure. The worst part was the effect it had on all of us who worked security. We became paranoid, jumping at shadows, constantly looking over our shoulders. The memorial park had always been a peaceful, if somewhat creepy place to work, but now it felt actively threatening. Even during my final weeks working there before I found my new job, I never felt safe during my patrols, especially in that eastern section where it had happened. I trained my replacement myself, made sure to tell him about the incident and to always pay special attention to that area. He thought I was being overly dramatic until his third week, when he called me at 2 a.m. He said he'd seen someone near the girls' memorial. When he approached, they didn't run, just walked calmly into the darkness like they had every right to be there. He followed but lost them among the graves. That was 5 years ago. I don't know if anything else has happened since then. I don't keep in touch with anyone from that job. Tried to put it all behind me. But sometimes when I'm driving at night and pass a cemetery or memorial park, I think about it, wonder if somewhere out there another security guard is discovering something horrible, wonder if that person is still out there visiting graves in the darkness with intentions too disturbing to comprehend. I have a daughter now. She's about the same age that little girl would have been, and it makes the memory even more painful to think that someone could do something so horrible to a child's resting place. I've never told my wife about what happened. She knows I used to work security, but not the details. Some things are better left unshared. But I needed to tell someone, eventually needed to get it out and warn others who might work similar jobs. If you ever work night security at a cemetery or memorial park and you see someone near a child's grave in the middle of the night, don't approach alone. Call for backup immediately. Because while most people who visit graves after hours are just grieving family members who want privacy, some of them have much darker intentions. And once you've seen what those people are capable of, you never forget it. Never stop looking over your shoulder. Never stop wondering when or where they'll surface again. That dark figure jumping up and running into the night haunts me still, not because of what they did, but because of what they were trying to do and what they might have succeeded in doing somewhere else where no security guard was watching. The real horror isn't in what we catch them doing, it's in imagining what happens when we don't catch them at all. The church groundskeeper. About 8 years ago, I worked as a nighttime groundskeeper for a large church with an attached cemetery. The job paid well and was fairly simple. All I needed to do was maintain the grounds after dark when the sprinklers ran and make sure no one was vandalizing church property. Every night was predictable, and after 6 months I'd grown accustomed to working alone among the headstones. After finishing my shift one night around 4 a.m., I headed home as usual. I typically didn't go to sleep until 9 or 10, and while I was eating lunch around noon, I got a call from the church administrator. She asked if I had seen anything strange last night, and I said no, because honestly I hadn't noticed anything unusual. She then told me that a grave in the children's section had been desecrated. I swore I hadn't seen anyone during my rounds, especially not any vandals. She asked if I could come back to help document the damage for the police report, and I immediately agreed, feeling guilty that this happened on my watch. When I got there, I was shocked by what I saw. This wasn't simple vandalism like knocking over flowers. Someone had carved horrible things into the headstone with what looked like a chisel. The words and symbols were deeply etched and filled with red paint. What made my stomach turn was reading who the grave belonged to. I won't give the name, but it was a little boy, only 7 years old, who had died just 6 weeks ago in an accident. I felt sick with anger and sadness. What kind of person defaces a child's grave? I spent the afternoon with the administrator and the pastor looking at security footage. The church property was large and we only had a few cameras, mostly covering the buildings. The cemetery section had just one camera at the entrance and the quality was poor. We saw nothing useful in the footage. The administrator filed a police report, and for the next month the church hired a security company to patrol with me at night. Those weeks were quiet. We didn't see anyone suspicious or find any more damage. One guard would walk the cemetery while I handled the grounds maintenance. The guard assigned to me was a retired cop named Frank. We got along well and spent hours theorizing about who would do such a thing, but as time passed it seemed like a one-time incident. After a month with no problems, the church ended the security contract to save money and I went back to working alone. Exactly 1 week later, things got worse. I was starting my shift around 9 p.m. and decided to check the children's section first since the vandalism I always started there. I parked my maintenance cart and walked through with my flashlight even though there were some dim path lights. When I was about 75 feet from the boys' grave, something looked wrong. I stopped and stared into the shadows, feeling my heart rate increase. I walked forward slowly, shining my light back and forth. At about 40 feet I pointed my flashlight directly at the grave. In the faint beam I could see a figure hunched over on the ground next to the headstone, completely still. I froze in terror, not sure if it was a person or my imagination playing tricks. I crept closer, and when I was maybe 25 feet away, the figure suddenly sprang up and sprinted away through the graves, vanishing into the darkness in seconds. I stood there shaking, trying to process what I'd seen. After a moment I got control of myself and ran back to call 911 from the church office. Then I returned to check the grave. What I found still makes me nauseous. There was a hole in front of the headstone, not big and clearly dug by hand without tools. It was only about a foot deep, but the disturbed earth made it obvious someone had been clawing at the ground trying to dig down. The thought of someone trying to reach that little boy's casket with their bare hands made me want to vomit. I never found out who it was and they were never caught, but it didn't happen again. The church installed motion lights throughout the cemetery, hired 2 full-time night security guards, and one always watched that specific section. They also put up a fence around the children's section with a locked gate. I kept that job for 2 more years and nothing like that ever happened again, but I never forgot. No ghosts, no supernatural events, just a sick person doing something unthinkable. The boys' parents never learned about the digging attempt. We all agreed they had suffered enough. But I know, and I still have nightmares about that hunched figure digging in the dark. The historic cemetery caretaker. About 15 years ago I was the night caretaker at a historic cemetery downtown. It was good work, decent money, and mostly involved driving around in a small truck checking for vandalism and making sure the gates stayed locked. Each night was the same routine, and by my second year I was completely comfortable working alone in a place most people found creepy. One morning after my shift ended at 6 a.m. I went home like always. I usually stayed up until noon and was having coffee around 11 when my boss called. He asked if I'd noticed anything wrong during the night, and I told him everything seemed normal. Then he said someone had damaged a grave in the old section. I assured him I hadn't seen anyone all night. He asked me to come back and meet with the police, and I said yes, immediately feeling terrible that I'd missed something. When I arrived and saw the damage, I felt sick. This went beyond typical vandalism. Someone had taken a hammer to a beautiful old headstone, smashing parts of it and spray painting disgusting words all over. The worst part was when I read the inscription. I can't share the name, but it was a young girl just 9 years old who had died in 1987. Her parents still visited every week, leaving fresh flowers. My chest tightened with fury. Who destroys a child's grave? I spent hours with my boss and the detective reviewing our limited security footage. The cemetery covered 40 acres and we only had cameras at the main office and entrance. Nothing covered the old section where this happened. The footage showed nothing helpful. The detective took statements, and for the next 2 weeks the cemetery hired extra security to patrol at night. Those weeks passed quietly, no vandalism, no trespassers, nothing suspicious. The extra guard would patrol one half while I covered the other. I worked well with the guard, a young guy named Marcus who was studying criminal justice. We talked a lot about who might target a child's grave, but never came up with answers. When 2 weeks passed without incident, management decided to end the extra security to cut costs. 5 days later I had my second encounter. I started my shift at 8 p.m. and went straight to check the vandalized grave, which had become my habit. I left my truck running and walked into the old section with my heavy-duty flashlight. Approaching the girl's grave from about 100 feet away, something felt off. I stopped walking and scanned the area with my light. I continued forward cautiously. At about 60 feet I aimed my beam at the grave site. A dark form was crouched by the headstone, motionless. My blood went cold. I couldn't tell if it was human or some trick of the shadows. I moved closer very slowly, and at roughly 30 feet the shape erupted into motion, bolting upright and racing away between the old headstones. I stood paralyzed for several seconds. Finally I ran back to my truck and radioed the police. Then I forced myself to go examine the grave. The sight nauseated me. Someone had been digging with their hands, creating a crude hole maybe 14 inches deep. The dirt was scattered everywhere, and I could see bloody scratches in the soil from their fingers. Whoever it was seemed desperate to reach the coffin below, using nothing but their hands. We never caught them, and they never returned. The cemetery installed bright lights in the old section, hired 3 night guards permanently, and one always watched over the children's graves. Security cameras were added throughout the property. I worked there another year before finding a day job, but that image haunts me. No paranormal activity, no creatures, just a disturbed person trying to dig up a child. The girl's parents were never told. It would have been too cruel. That dark figure fleeing into the night still appears in my dreams. The rural cemetery watchman. About 10 years ago, I took a job as the night watchman at a small rural cemetery. The pay was fair and the work was easy, mainly just driving around the property in an old pickup, making sure no kids were drinking or causing trouble. Every night followed the same pattern, and after a few months I'd gotten used to the solitude and quiet. After completing my shift one morning around 5:30 a.m., I drove home. I typically stayed awake until 11 and was making breakfast at 10 when I received a call from the cemetery director. He asked if anything unusual happened overnight, and I said no because I genuinely hadn't seen anything. He informed me that a child's grave had been vandalized. I insisted I hadn't noticed any trespassers during my rounds. He requested I return to assess the damage and assist with the police report, and I agreed right away, feeling responsible. When I saw the vandalism, I was horrified. This wasn't minor mischief. Someone had poured acid or something corrosive on the headstone, eating away at the carved angels and the child's name. They'd also dug up all the flowers and scattered garbage everywhere. Reading what remained of the headstone made me furious. I won't reveal the name, but she was a little girl only 8 years old who had passed just 2 months prior from illness. I felt rage building inside me. What monster does this to a child's resting place? The director and I spent time checking our minimal security system. The cemetery was small with basic equipment. We had one camera at the entrance and another at the equipment shed. Nothing covered the area where this happened. We found nothing useful on the recordings. Police were called, and for 3 weeks the cemetery board paid for an off-duty officer to patrol with me at night. Those weeks were uneventful. No vandalism, no intruders, nothing. The officer would cover half the cemetery while I watched the other half. The officer was a woman named Deputy Chin who had lost a child herself years ago. We bonded over our disgust at someone targeting a child's grave. After 3 weeks of peace, the board stopped paying for extra security. 6 nights later, everything changed. I began my shift at 9 p.m. and headed straight for the vandalized grave, as had become my routine. I parked nearby and walked over with my flashlight, cutting through the darkness. From about 80 feet away, something seemed wrong. I paused and swept my light across the area. I advanced slowly. At 50 feet, I shined my light on the grave. Someone was kneeling beside it, perfectly still. Fear shot through me. I couldn't process what I was seeing. I inched forward, and at about 35 feet the person launched upward and ran, disappearing into the maze of headstones. I remained frozen in shock. Eventually I sprinted back to radio the police. Then I made myself return to the grave. The discovery sickened me. A rough hole had been excavated by hand, perhaps 16 inches deep. Fingernail marks were visible in the dirt, and there were dark stains that looked like blood from torn fingers. Someone had frantically tried to dig through to the casket using only their hands. They were never identified or caught, but they didn't return. The cemetery installed solar lights throughout, hired 2 permanent night guards, and stationed one specifically in that section. Motion sensors were added around all children's graves. I stayed 6 more months before taking a factory job, but I'll never forget. No spirits, no demons, just a twisted human being. We kept this from the girl's family. They'd been through enough. That figure racing away into darkness still haunts my thoughts. The municipal cemetery guard. About 7 years ago, I worked as a night guard at the city's main cemetery. It was steady work with decent benefits and mostly consisted of patrolling in a security vehicle and preventing vandalism. Each night was routine, and within a year I was completely comfortable with the graveyard atmosphere. After finishing my usual shift around 4:30 a.m., I headed home. I normally didn't sleep until 10 or 11 and was watching TV at 9:30 when my supervisor called. He asked if I'd observed anything unusual overnight, and I said I hadn't seen anything. He then told me someone had vandalized a grave in the newer section. I maintained I hadn't seen anyone during my patrols. He asked me to return immediately to document everything for insurance, and I agreed, feeling guilty. This happened during my watch. When I saw the damage, my heart sank. This exceeded normal vandalism. Someone had taken power tools to the granite headstone, cutting deep grooves and filling them with black paint, forming horrible words and satanic symbols. What devastated me was seeing whose grave it was. I can't give details, but it was a young boy, only 11 years old, who had died 8 weeks earlier in a drowning accident. I felt overwhelming sadness and anger. What person attacks a child's memorial? My supervisor and I reviewed the security footage with a detective. The cemetery was massive, and despite recent upgrades, we only had cameras covering main roads and buildings. The section where this occurred had no coverage. The recordings revealed nothing. Police investigated, and for a month the city assigned 2 officers to patrol with me each night. That month passed peacefully, no incidents, no suspicious people, nothing. One officer would patrol the north sections while I covered the south. I got along well with Officer Rodriguez, who had worked cemetery details before. We spent hours discussing what motivates someone to desecrate a child's grave. After a month without problems, the city ended the extra patrols due to budget constraints. Exactly 1 week later, the situation escalated. Starting my shift at 8:30 p.m., I went directly to check the boy's grave, which had become my nightly ritual. I stopped my vehicle and proceeded on foot using my tactical flashlight. From approximately 90 feet away, something felt wrong. I halted and searched the darkness with my light. I moved forward carefully. At 45 feet, I illuminated the grave directly. A figure was crouched there, digging with their hands, completely absorbed in their task. Terror gripped me as I tried to comprehend the scene. I approached slowly, and at about 20 feet the person sensed me and exploded upward, running away through the headstones. I stood petrified, unable to move. Finally, I ran to my vehicle and called police dispatch. Then I steeled myself to inspect the damage. What I discovered was revolting. Someone had clawed out a hole roughly 18 inches deep. Their bloody handprints were visible in the loose soil, and torn fingernails were mixed in the dirt. They'd been desperately trying to reach the vault below using only their bare hands. The perpetrator was never found but never returned. The cemetery installed LED lighting everywhere, hired 3 full-time night guards, and assigned 1 exclusively to patrol children's sections. Surveillance cameras now monitor every section. I transferred to a daytime position after 6 months, but the memory persists. No supernatural elements, no monsters, just a deranged individual. The boy's parents were never informed. We all felt they'd endured enough tragedy. That crouching figure digging frantically still invades my sleep. When darkness falls, I remember and wonder if somewhere another guard is discovering the same horror. These are the things that make night security work truly frightening, not ghosts or legends, but the depths of human depravity. The real terror is knowing such people exist, moving through the darkness with incomprehensible intentions toward the most innocent graves. And once you've witnessed it, you never feel safe in cemeteries again. The school night custodian. I worked as a night custodian at an elementary school for about 6 years. The job was pretty straightforward and paid better than most cleaning jobs I'd had. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. and mostly involved cleaning classrooms, mopping hallways, and making sure everything was ready for the kids the next morning. Usually I was alone in the building, except on Fridays when another custodian would help with the deep cleaning, but this happened on a Tuesday night in October. I was about 3 hours into my shift cleaning the 3rd grade wing when I heard something that made me stop mopping. It was singing. Not loud singing, but soft, like someone humming a lullaby. It was coming from somewhere down the hallway. Now I need to explain that this school was built in the 1950s, and it had these long hallways with classrooms on both sides. The acoustics were weird and sounds would echo in strange ways. I turned off my music and listened. The singing continued. I figured maybe a teacher had stayed late grading papers. It happens sometimes, so I walked down the hall to check. The sound led me to room 312, Mrs. Patterson's class. The door was closed, but I could see light coming from underneath. I knocked gently and called out, "Hello." The singing stopped immediately. I waited a few seconds, then tried the door handle. It was locked, which was normal. Teachers locked their rooms when they left. But here's the thing, I could still see that light under the door, and now I could hear movement inside, like furniture being moved. I knocked again, louder this time, announcing that I was maintenance. No response. Something felt wrong about the situation, so I got my master key and slowly opened the door. The classroom was dark. I flipped on the lights and looked around. Everything seemed normal, desks and neat rows, artwork on the walls, the usual elementary school classroom. But there was a smell in the air, something sweet and rotten, like fruit that had gone bad. I did a quick check of the room. Nobody was there. I even looked in the coat closet and behind the teacher's desk. Nothing. I was about to leave when I noticed something on the whiteboard. Someone had drawn a picture in red marker. It was crude, like a child's drawing, but it showed what looked like a person lying down with X's for eyes. Underneath, in shaky letters, it said, "She won't wake up." I stared at that drawing for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Maybe some kid's inappropriate joke, but how did it get there after school hours? I erased it and finished checking the room. That's when I found the source of the smell. In the trash can by the teacher's desk was a lunch bag filled with what used to be a sandwich and apple, both completely covered in mold, but on top was a note. It said "I'm sorry mommy" in crayon. I reported it to my supervisor the next morning, but he just shrugged, said kids leave weird stuff all the time, told me to be more careful about locking doors. But I knew I hadn't left any doors unlocked, and that singing, I know what I heard. The next few weeks were normal, no more singing, no more drawings. I started to relax. Then about a month later I was cleaning the second floor when I heard it again. Same soft singing, same lullaby, but this time it was moving. I could hear it travel from one end of the hallway to the other like someone was walking and singing. I followed the sound, but every time I got close it would stop. When I'd give up and go back to work it would start again, always just out of sight. This went on for about an hour, then suddenly the fire alarm went off. Not the normal alarm, but the trouble alarm that sounds when there's a malfunction. I went to the panel and it showed an alert for the basement. I grabbed my flashlight and headed down. The basement was mostly storage and the boiler room, kids weren't allowed down there. As I descended the stairs I heard the singing again, but louder, clearer. It was definitely a child's voice. The basement hallway was dark, only emergency lighting. I made my way toward the boiler room where the alarm panel said the trouble was. The door was open, which was wrong, it was always kept locked. Inside I found chaos. Someone had pulled everything off the storage shelves, boxes of old textbooks scattered everywhere, supplies dumped on the floor, and on the wall written in what looked like black marker over and over, "She's sleeping, she's sleeping, she's sleeping, she's sleeping." The singing had stopped, but I heard something else, breathing, heavy labored breathing coming from behind the boiler. I should have left right then, should have called the police, but I didn't. I walked around the boiler shining my light. There was a small figure huddled in the corner, a child maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing pajamas and no shoes. I said, "Hey, are you okay?" The child looked up at me and I'll never forget that face. It was a little girl, but her expression was completely blank. Her eyes were open but unfocused, like she was sleepwalking. She stood up slowly, never breaking that empty stare, and started walking toward me. I backed up, asking her name, telling her she needed to leave, but she kept coming. When she reached the doorway she turned and ran, not like a normal kid runs, but in this weird mechanical way, like her body was on autopilot. I chased after her, but she was fast. By the time I reached the stairs she was gone. I searched the entire school, every classroom, every closet, every possible hiding spot. I found nothing. I called the police and my supervisor. The cops came and did their own search, also found nothing. They took my statement, but I could tell they thought I was making it up or had imagined it. My supervisor was furious about the mess in the basement, accused me of doing it myself. I kept working there, but things got worse. Almost every night I would hear that singing, sometimes close, sometimes far away. Objects would be moved in classrooms, doors I had locked would be found open. Then I started finding more notes. They were always in children's handwriting, always apologizing. "I'm sorry, I was bad, I'm sorry I made noise, I'm sorry I didn't clean my room." And always at the bottom, "Mommy is sleeping." I researched the school's history, spent hours in the library looking up old newspapers. I found it eventually. In 1987, a second-grade student named Amy Chen had died. It wasn't at school, but at home. Her mother had overdosed on sleeping pills. Amy tried to wake her up for 2 days before a neighbor found them. Amy had spent those 2 days taking care of herself, getting ready for school, making her own lunches, writing notes to her mother, apologizing for things, thinking if she was good enough, Mommy would wake up. She was 7 years old. The article included a picture of Amy, and I knew immediately. It was the same face I'd seen in the boiler room. I tried to tell people, but who would believe me? A ghost child wandering the school at night, singing lullabies, leaving apologetic notes. It sounded insane. But I knew what I was experiencing. I lasted another 2 months. The breaking point came when I found her. I was cleaning the library when I heard crying, not singing this time, but quiet sobbing. I found her sitting in the reading corner, surrounded by picture books. She looked more solid this time, more real. She was reading a book about mothers and daughters, tears streaming down her face. I sat down nearby, not too close, and said, "Amy." She looked at me, really looked at me for the first time. "Why won't she wake up?" she asked. I didn't know what to say. How do you explain death to a child who's been gone for decades? "She comes to my room at night," Amy continued, "but she won't open her eyes. I try to be good, I clean up, I make my lunch, but she won't wake up." "I'm sorry," I said. She stared at me for a long moment, then asked, "Am I in trouble?" "No, you're not in trouble. I miss her." "I know." We sat there in silence for a while, then she stood up, walked to the door, and vanished. I never saw her again after that night. The singing stopped, the notes stopped, the disturbances ended. I worked there for another month, then found a day job. I never told anyone else about that final encounter. What would be the point? But sometimes I think about Amy, still trying to wake her mother, still apologizing for things that weren't her fault, still waiting for someone to tell her it's okay. The school is still there, kids still learn in those classrooms, and I wonder if any of them sense her. I hope not. I hope she found peace. I hope she finally understood that some people, no matter how good you are, no matter how hard you try, just won't wake up. That's the real horror, not the ghost of a child, but the tragedy that created her, a 7-year-old girl alone with her mother's body, trying to be good enough to bring her back. I still have one of her notes. I kept it. I don't know why. It says, "I'm sorry I sang too loud. Mommy, please wake up. I'll be quiet." Written in red crayon on lined paper, the letters shaky and uneven. Sometimes late at night I look at it and remember that empty stare, that mechanical walk, that soft singing. And I pray that somewhere Amy finally understands it wasn't her fault. That her mother's sleep had nothing to do with how good or quiet she was. But I don't think she does. I think she's still there in that school, still singing, still trying to wake someone who will never wake up. The hospital night porter. I spent 5 years working as a night porter at a large hospital in the Midwest. It wasn't glamorous work, mostly moving equipment, cleaning areas after hours, and transporting various items between departments. The night shift was from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and after a while you got used to the weird atmosphere hospitals have at night, the long empty corridors, the distant beeping of machines, the occasional emergency. This particular incident happened during my 3rd year on a Wednesday night in January. I was doing my usual rounds on the 4th floor, which housed long-term care patients, when I noticed something odd. One of the supply room doors was open just a crack, with light spilling out into the hallway. These rooms were supposed to be locked after 8 p.m., only accessible with a keycard, so I went to investigate. As I approached, I heard voices inside, 2 people having what sounded like an argument, though I couldn't make out the words. I pushed the door open and said, "Maintenance, is anyone in here?" The room was empty. But the light was on, and several boxes of medical supplies had been opened and rifled through, gloves, syringes, gauze scattered on the floor. I started cleaning up the mess, figuring some nurse had been in a hurry, when I noticed something that made me stop. On one of the shelves, someone had arranged medical supplies to spell out words. "Help me." I stared at it for a moment, then quickly put everything away and locked the room. I reported it to the night supervisor, who said it was probably just someone playing a prank, told me not to worry about it. But something bothered me about the whole thing, the way those voices had stopped the instant I opened the door, the deliberate arrangement of those supplies. Over the next few nights I paid more attention to that floor. That's when I started noticing the patient in room 4811. According to the chart by the door, the room was occupied by a Mr. David Thompson, admitted for chronic care, but whenever I passed by, the room was dark and quiet. Most long-term patients had visitors, family members who would come even during odd hours, but 4811 never had anyone. One night, about a week after the supply room incident, I was mopping the hallway when I heard a sound from 4811. It was a tapping, rhythmic and deliberate tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause. I moved closer to the door and listened. The tapping continued. I knocked softly and announced housekeeping. The tapping stopped. I used my keycard and slowly opened the door. The room was dimly lit by the various monitors and equipment. There was definitely someone in the bed. I could see the shape under the blankets, but they were completely still. I was about to leave when I noticed the heart monitor. It was flatlined. I hit the emergency button, and within seconds nurses rushed and they pushed me aside and began working on the patient. But something was wrong. One of the nurses checked the equipment and said this machine hasn't been connected for days. They pulled back the blankets and I saw what was in the bed. It wasn't a person, it was pillows arranged to look like a body. The head nurse turned to me and asked, "What made you come in here?" I told her about the tapping sound. She looked concerned and made a call. Security arrived and they did a search of the room. That's when they found him. There was a man hiding in the bathroom ceiling. He'd removed one of the panels and was lying across the support beams. When they got him down, I recognized him immediately. It was David Thompson, the patient who was supposed to be in that bed, but he looked different, wild-eyed, disheveled, and terrified. He kept saying, they're coming back," over and over. Security restrained him while the nurses sedated him. They moved him to the psychiatric ward, and I was told to forget what I'd seen. But I couldn't. I started asking questions, found out that David Thompson had been admitted 2 months earlier, not for chronic care but for severe paranoid delusions. He believed that someone was stealing patients from the hospital, taking them somewhere and replacing them with what he called empty people. The staff thought he was delusional until he disappeared from his bed one night. They found him 3 days later hiding in a storage closet on the 2nd floor, claimed he'd seen them take his roommate, said they tried to take him too. After that incident, they moved him to a private room, 4811, and increased his medication. But he kept escaping, kept hiding, kept leaving those messages. I tried to forget about it, focus on my work, but then other strange things started happening. I would find doors that should be locked standing open. Equipment moved from where it should be. And sometimes late at night I would hear footsteps in the ceiling. Not the normal sounds of the building settling, but deliberate footsteps moving from room to room. One night about a month later I was cleaning the third floor when I heard a commotion from the stairwell. I went to check and found David Thompson again, but this time he wasn't alone. He had an elderly woman with him and was trying to lead her up the stairs. She looked confused, frightened. David saw me and said, "Please, you have to help us, they're coming." Before I could respond, security appeared. They grabbed David, but he kept shouting, "Check the basement," he yelled. "Check room B12, that's where they take them." Security dragged him away and the elderly woman was returned to her room. I should have left it alone, but that night after my shift I went to the basement. Room B12 was at the end of a long corridor in an area that was supposedly used for storage. The door was locked, but I could see light underneath. I used my keycard, but it didn't work. This lock was different, newer. I was about to leave when I heard something from inside. Voices, multiple voices, and they sounded distressed. I ran back upstairs and found the night supervisor. Told him what I'd heard. He looked annoyed but agreed to check it out. We went back down together and he produced a different keycard. The door opened to reveal a makeshift medical facility. There were 4 beds, each occupied by a patient hooked up to various machines, but something was wrong. The patients were all unconscious, and beside each bed was a cooler marked with medical labels. The supervisor's face went white. He immediately called security and told me to leave. I was questioned by police the next day, but they didn't tell me what they'd found. The official story was that some staff members had been running an illegal organ harvesting operation using terminal patients who had no family. But David Thompson knew better. I saw him one more time before I quit. He was being transferred to another facility and I happened to be in the loading area when they brought him through. He looked at me with those wild eyes and said, "You know, now you've seen them." I asked him who they were. Not who, he said. What? "They've been here longer than the hospital." He continued, "Feeding on the sick, the dying, the forgotten." The orderly started to move him, but he shouted one last thing. "They're still here. They'll always be here as long as there are people no one will miss." I quit the next week, found a job at a warehouse. But I still think about what I saw in that basement, those patients hooked up to machines, those coolers. And I think about David Thompson hiding in the ceiling trying to save people everyone thought were crazy. Sometimes the real horror isn't what we can see and understand. It's what operates just beneath the surface in places we trust, using our assumptions against us. David wasn't paranoid, he was right. And somewhere in that hospital they're still there. Still taking the forgotten. Still feeding. The mall security night shift. I worked night security at a shopping mall for about 4 years. This was one of those dying malls, you know, the kind half the stores empty, food court mostly shut down, just hanging on. My shift was 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. and honestly it was usually boring, just walking around empty corridors, checking doors, making sure no one broke in to steal from the few remaining stores. This happened during my second year working there. It was a Thursday night in September and the mall was especially dead. I was doing my rounds on the second floor when I heard music. Not loud music, but faint, like someone had left a radio on in one of the stores. I followed the sound to what used to be a toy store that had closed 6 months earlier. The gate was down, but I could definitely hear music coming from inside. I tried to see through the gate, but it was too dark. I radioed my partner Greg, who was checking the first floor, and told him about it. He came up and listened. Yeah, he heard it too. Sounded like kids' music, like something from a children's show. We had keys to all the stores for emergencies, so we unlocked the gate and rolled it up. The music got louder as we entered. It was definitely children's music, but distorted, like it was playing from a damaged speaker. We turned on our flashlights and moved through the empty store. The place was creepy. All the fixtures were still there, but covered in dust, empty shelves, broken displays. It looked like they'd left in a hurry. The music was coming from the back storage area. We pushed through the door marked employees only and found the source. In the middle of the storage room, someone had set up a bizarre scene. There were about a dozen old toys arranged in a circle, all facing inward, and in the center was an ancient-looking cassette player playing that warped music. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The toys all had photographs taped to them, school photos of children, and each photo had a date written on it. The dates ranged from 1987 to just a few months ago. Greg wanted to leave, call the cops, let them deal with it, but I was looking at one of the photos. I recognized the kid. It was a boy who'd gone missing earlier that year. I'd seen his picture on the news, his family putting up posters. I checked another photo, another missing child, this one from the 90s. They were all missing children. We called the police immediately. They arrived within minutes and took the whole scene very seriously. They collected all the photos, the toys, the cassette player, dusted for prints, asked us dozens of questions. Then they searched the rest of the store. In a maintenance closet they found more. Boxes and boxes of photos, hundreds of them, all children, all with dates. Some going back to when the mall first opened in 1983. The detective in charge told us to keep quiet about what we'd found, said it was an active investigation. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who had been collecting photos of missing children for decades, and why set up that display in an abandoned toy store? I started paying more attention during my rounds, especially to the empty stores. That's when I began noticing things. Stores that had been closed for years would sometimes have lights on inside just for a moment. Security cameras would malfunction, but only in certain areas, always near the abandoned stores. And sometimes late at night I would hear that music again. Faint, distorted, coming from different locations. Greg quit after a month, said the place was too creepy. I stayed, but I started doing research. The mall had a dark history. In 1985, a 5-year-old girl named Sarah Chen went missing from the toy store, the same one where we'd found the photos. Her mother had turned away for just a moment and Sarah was gone. They searched everywhere, never found her. In 1991, another child, 7-year-old Marcus Williams, vanished from the mall food court. 1996, Emma Rodriguez, age 6, last seen in the arcade. 2001, Tyler Brooks, age 8, disappeared from the bathroom. The list went on. Always young children, always vanished without a trace, always at this mall. But here's the thing that really got to me. The mall never closed. After each disappearance there would be a brief investigation, some bad publicity, but the mall stayed open. Stores would leave, new ones would move in, and people would forget. Except someone hadn't forgotten. Someone had been keeping track. About 2 months after we found the photos, I was doing my 2 a.m. rounds when I heard crying. It sounded like a child, and it was coming from the old arcade on the 2nd floor. I approached carefully. The gate was down and locked, but I could see light flickering inside. I called for backup, but the new guy Tommy was on the other side of the mall. I decided to wait, but the crying was getting louder, more desperate. I unlocked the gate and went in. The arcade was a time capsule, dust-covered games from the 80s and 90s, their screens dark and cracked. But in the back corner one machine was on. It was an old claw machine, the kind where you try to grab stuffed animals. Inside, among the decay toys, was a child. A real child, a little boy, maybe 6 years old. He was crying and banging on the glass. I ran over and tried to open the machine, but it was locked. The boy saw me and started screaming louder. "Help me, please help me." I grabbed a fire extinguisher and smashed the glass. The boy tumbled out and I caught him. He was real solid, alive. I picked him up and carried him out of the arcade, calling 911 as I ran. But as we reached the main corridor, he started struggling. "No, no, no," he screamed, "you can't take me back." "Back where?" I asked. "To the room," he said, "to the white room with all the others." Before I could ask more, the lights went out. All of them, the entire mall plunged into darkness. I held the boy tighter and ran for the exit. Behind us I heard footsteps. Not running, but walking steadily, purposefully. The boy was sobbing. He said, "He found me, he always finds us." I burst through the emergency exit, setting off alarms. Police arrived quickly and took the boy. His name was Jacob Morrison. He'd been missing for 2 days from a town an hour away. He told police he'd been in a white room with other children, but when they pressed for details he would just cry. They searched the mall again, more thoroughly this time. They found a hidden access panel in the arcade. It led to a maintenance area that wasn't on any blueprint. Inside they found a room. White walls, white floor, no windows. And photographs covering every surface. Hundreds, maybe thousands of photos of children. But the room was empty, no other children, no sign of whoever had taken Jacob. They never found anyone. The mall closed permanently after that, officially for renovations, but it never reopened. I drive by sometimes, it's still there, empty, decaying. And I wonder about that room. Jacob said there were others, but they only found him. Where did the others go? Who had been taking children for 40 years? And why did they let Jacob go? Or did he escape? The detective told me something before I left that job. He said Jacob kept talking about a man, but he couldn't describe him. Said the man looked different every time he saw him. Sometimes old, sometimes young, sometimes he looked like someone Jacob knew. But his eyes were always the same. Empty, like looking into holes. They never caught anyone, never found the other children, never explained how Jacob ended up in that claw machine. The mall is still empty, still standing. And sometimes people report seeing lights inside, hearing music. Children's music. The bus depot night dispatcher. I worked as a night dispatcher at the Greyhound bus depot for 7 years. Sounds boring, and mostly it was sitting in a booth announcing departures, coordinating with drivers, handling the occasional lost passenger. My shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. at a depot that serviced maybe 15 buses a night, not exactly Grand Central Station. This happened about 3 years into the job on a Tuesday night in November, cold night, hardly any passengers. Around 2 a.m. I got a call from one of our drivers, Eddie, on Route 47 coming up from Atlanta. He sounded shaken, which was unusual. Eddie was an old-timer, been driving for 20 years, nothing rattled him. "Dispatch, I got a situation here," he said. "What's going on, Eddie?" "I got a passenger won't get off the bus." I checked my screen. Route 47 had reached its final stop 20 minutes ago. All passengers should have disembarked. "Just call security," I said. "That's the thing," Eddie replied. "She says she's waiting for her stop, but we're at the end of the line." I told him I'd come out and handle it. The bus was parked in Bay 12 at the far end of the depot. I walked out into the cold night air and climbed aboard. Eddie was standing at the front looking frustrated. In the very back row was a single passenger. A young woman, maybe early 20s, wearing a floral dress that looked like it was from the 1970s. I walked down the aisle and said, "Excuse me, miss, this is the last stop. You need to exit the bus." She turned to look at me and something was off about her expression. Blank, like she was looking through me. "I'm waiting for my stop," she said, her voice flat, monotone. "This is the final stop," I explained. "Everyone has to get off here." She shook her head slowly. "No, my stop is Miller's Crossing. I need to get to Miller's Crossing." I glanced at Eddie, who shrugged. "Miss, there is no Miller's Crossing on this route," I said. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "There used to be." I went back to Eddie and quietly asked if he'd been drinking. He was offended, said he was stone cold sober. I returned to the woman and tried again. "Look, I don't know what to tell you, but you can't stay on the bus." She stood up suddenly and I noticed her dress was wet. Not just damp, but soaking, like she'd been in rain, but it hadn't rained in days. "I'll wait," she said, and sat back down. I called security, but Frank, the night guard, was dealing with some drunk guy at the terminal, said he'd be there in 10 minutes. So I waited with Eddie, keeping an eye on the woman. She just sat there staring out the window at nothing. Then she started humming some old tune I didn't recognize, but it made my skin crawl. Eddie whispered to me, "This is the third time." What? I asked. "Third time this month," he said. "Different drivers, but same thing. Woman in the back won't get off, asking for Miller's Crossing." I was about to respond when the bus lurched. The engine wasn't on, the keys were in Eddie's hand, but the bus moved forward about 10 feet, then stopped. The woman stood up. "This is my stop," she said. She walked past us down the aisle and stepped off the bus. But here's the thing, she didn't walk away. She stood next to the bus, staring at us through the window, still smiling that empty smile. Then the depot lights flickered and she was gone. Not walked away, gone, like she was never there. Eddie and I stood there in silence for a moment. Then he said, "I'm putting in for day shifts." I went back to my booth and did something I'd never done before. I looked up Miller's Crossing. It had been a bus stop on Route 47, but not for Greyhound. For a company called Silver Line Coaches that went out of business in 1979. I dug deeper, found old newspaper archives. November 15, 1979, a Silver Line coach crashed during a storm 5 miles from Miller's Crossing. 23 passengers died, including a young woman named Rebecca Marsh. The article had a photo. It was her. Same face, same floral dress. She'd been traveling home for Thanksgiving, never made it. I showed Eddie the article the next night. He went pale and said, "I'm done, no more Route 47. But other drivers had to take it. And about once a month, sometimes more, I get the same call. Passenger won't get off, asking for Miller's Crossing." Always the same description, young woman, floral dress. But here's what really bothered me. The bus movements. Every time she appeared, the bus would move on its own. Exactly 10 feet forward. I measured it, and I found out why. The old Miller's Crossing stop was exactly 10 feet from where Bay 12 is now. When they rebuilt the depot in 1985, they paved over the old stop locations. She wasn't confused. She knew exactly where her stop was. We just built our depot on top of it. I started keeping a log. November was the worst, that's when the accident happened. But she appeared other months too, always on Route 47, always late at night. Some drivers refused to take that route after encountering her. Management didn't care, said it was superstition, threatened to fire anyone who refused their assigned routes. Then one night in November, 3 years after I first saw her, something different happened. I was in my booth when I heard a bus engine start. I looked out and saw a bus pulling out of Bay 12, but there was no bus scheduled to depart for another hour. I ran out shouting for it to stop. The bus kept going, drove right through the depot exit and onto the street. I called the police, reported a stolen bus, gave them the plate number. They found it an hour later, parked at a gas station 5 miles down Route 47, 5 miles from where Miller's Crossing used to be, exactly where that crash happened in 1979. The bus was empty, engine off, keys in the ignition, but the back seat where she always sat was soaking wet, and there was mud on the floor, the kind of mud you'd find at a crash site that had been disturbed. After that I couldn't do it anymore. Every time a bus pulled into Bay 12 I wondered if she was on it. Every time Route 47 came through I held my breath. I quit, found a job at a warehouse, but I still think about her. Rebecca Marsh, who died trying to get home. Still trying 40 years later. Still waiting for her stop. And I think about all the other routes, all the other accidents, all the other passengers who never made it home. Are they all still riding? Still waiting? Still trying to reach stops that no longer exist? The depot is still there, still operating. Bay 12 is still in use. And somewhere on Route 47 between Atlanta and here is a young woman in a floral dress, waiting for Miller's Crossing, waiting to finally go home. The office building night janitor. I cleaned offices at night for about 8 years. It was decent work, good pay, and I liked the quiet, just me, my cart, and empty buildings. This happened at a 30-story office tower downtown, one of those glass and steel places full of law firms and financial companies. My shift was 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. and I usually worked with 2 other janitors, but on this particular night in March they both called in sick. I didn't mind working alone, meant I could listen to my music and work at my own pace. I started on the top floor and worked my way down. That was my routine. Around midnight I was on the 20th floor cleaning a law firm's offices when I noticed something strange. One of the conference rooms had its lights on. Not unusual in itself, lawyers work late, but what caught my attention was the arrangement. All the chairs around the big conference table had been turned to face outward toward the walls. And in each chair was a legal pad. I went in to straighten things up, figuring some weird meeting had happened. But when I looked at the legal pads, they all had writing on them. The same sentence written over and over, filling every page. I deserve this, I deserve this, I deserve this, I deserve this. Hundreds of times in different handwriting. Some neat and precise, some increasingly frantic. The last pages were just scribbles like someone writing in the dark. I collected the pads and threw them in my trash bag, fixed the chairs and moved on. But it bothered me, who writes the same thing over and over like that? 2 nights later, same floor, different conference room. Chairs facing the walls, legal pads filled with writing. But this time the sentence was different. I can't stop them, I can't stop them, I can't stop them. I checked the sign and logs for the building. No one had badged in after 7 p.m. Security cameras showed empty hallways. I reported it to building management. They said they'd look into it. A week passed without incident. Then I got to the 15th floor, an accounting firm, and found every single office door open. Not just unlocked, but wide open. And every computer was on. All displaying the same thing. A single word in huge white letters on a black screen. Jump. I went from office to office, turning off monitors, closing doors, trying not to think about what I was seeing. In the last office I found something else. The window was open. This was wrong, these windows didn't open, they were sealed. But this one was wide open, cold air rushing in. And on the desk was a note. Not handwritten but printed. It said, "Thank you for cleaning up after us, we're sorry for the mess." Signed with 13 names. I closed the window, though I don't know how it was open, and got out of there. I looked up those names later. All employees of various companies in the building. All had died over the past 5 years. All suicide. All jumped from the building. The next night I was ready to quit, but I needed the money, so I came back. I brought sage, like my grandmother always said would clear bad energy. I know it sounds stupid, but I was desperate. I was on the 25th floor when I heard the elevator ding. Someone getting off on my floor at 1 a.m. I called out, "Hello, cleaning service." No response. I heard footsteps in the hallway, multiple sets walking in different directions. I followed the sounds but saw no one. Then I heard typing. Coming from every direction, keyboards clicking away. I looked in one office, dark, but I could hear typing. Turned on the light, no one there, but the keyboard was moving. Keys pressing down by themselves. Typing the same phrase over and over. I deserve this, I can't stop them. I ran for the elevator. As I waited I heard them. Voices whispering from every office. Some crying, some laughing, some just repeating those phrases. The elevator came and I got in. But it didn't go down. It went up. All the way to the 30th floor. The doors opened to darkness. I frantically pressed the button for the ground floor. The elevator didn't move. Then I heard them coming. Footsteps, lots of them coming down the hallway toward the elevator. I pressed myself against the back wall. Shadows appeared in the doorway. People in business clothes, but wrong. Their faces were blank like unfinished sketches. They filed into the elevator with me. 13 of them. They didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge me. Just stood there as the elevator began to descend. At each floor more got on. By the 10th floor I could barely breathe, packed in with these things. And they were all whispering. I deserve this, I can't stop them, I deserve this, I can't stop them. The elevator reached the ground floor. They all walked out in single file toward the exit. I followed at a distance. They walked through the lobby, out the door, and stopped on the sidewalk. Then one by one they looked up at the building and disappeared. I quit that night. Didn't even finish my shift, just left my card and walked out. I found out later from a friend who still worked there. The building has a problem. About once a month someone jumps. Always an office worker, always after writing those same phrases. Building management knows, but what can they do? Put up higher barriers, install nets. They've tried. People still jump. And late at night janitors still find conference rooms set up wrong. Computers displaying that word. Windows that shouldn't open standing wide. They go through janitors quickly now. Most don't last more than a few weeks. Because once you've seen them, once you've heard them typing their final messages, you can't unsee it. You clean those offices knowing that tomorrow or next week or next month, someone else will sit at that desk. And eventually they'll start writing. I deserve this. I can't stop them. And late one night they'll take the elevator to the top floor and become another shadow, another whisper, another mess for the night janitor to clean up. I work days now at a small office building, only 5 floors. No conference rooms, no legal pads, no windows that open. But sometimes when I'm leaving work and I see those tall office towers, I think about the janitors starting their shifts, walking into dark offices not knowing what they'll find. And I think about those 13 shadows, still riding the elevators, still whispering, still jumping, over and over, forever. The job that changed everything. I never thought a simple security job would be the thing that made me question everything I thought I knew about being safe. But here I am, months later, still checking my locks twice before bed and jumping at every little sound. It started back in March when I got hired as a night security guard at this old office building downtown. The pay was decent, and honestly, I needed the money. My day job at the warehouse wasn't cutting it anymore, and bills don't wait for anyone. The building manager, Mr. Peterson, seemed nice enough when he interviewed me. He explained that my job was pretty straightforward. Just walk around the building every hour, check all the doors, and make sure nobody was trying to break in. It's mostly just to make the insurance company happy, he told me with a laugh. We've never had any real problems here. Just need someone to keep an eye on things. The building itself was nothing special. Just your typical 5-story office building with a bunch of small businesses, accounting firms, lawyers, that sort of thing. During the day it was full of people coming and going, but at night it was supposed to be completely empty except for me. My shift started at 11 p.m. and ended at 7 a.m. 8 hours of basically doing nothing but walking around and trying to stay awake. I figured it would be boring, but boring was fine with me. I brought books to read and downloaded some podcasts to listen to while I did my rounds. The first few nights went exactly like I expected. I'd arrive at 11, check in with the day guard who was finishing up, and then settle into the small security office on the first floor. The office had a desk, a chair, and a wall of monitors showing feeds from security cameras placed around the building. Most of the cameras showed hallways and entrances, pretty standard stuff. I developed a routine pretty quickly. Every hour on the hour, I do a complete walkthrough of all 5 floors. I had a set of keys that opened every door in the building, and I was supposed to check each floor methodically. Start at the ground floor, work my way up to the 5th floor, then back down. It usually took about 20 minutes if I didn't rush. Between rounds, I'd sit in the office, watch the monitors, and try to find ways to pass the time. The building was old, so it made a lot of settling noises, creaks and groans that you'd expect from a place built in the 1960s. After a few nights, I got used to the sounds and barely noticed them anymore. The other guard, Dave, who worked the evening shift before me, seemed like a good guy. He'd been doing security work for about 10 years and had plenty of stories about different jobs he'd had. On my 4th night, he stuck around a few extra minutes to chat. This place is pretty quiet, he told me as he gathered up his stuff. Never had any real issues here. Sometimes you might hear the cleaning crew if they're running late, but they're usually done by 10 p.m. He paused at the door and looked back at me. Oh, and if you ever see anything weird on the cameras, just write it down in the logbook. Probably nothing, but Mr. Peterson likes us to keep track of everything. What kind of weird stuff? I asked. Dave shrugged. You know, just anything that seems off. Like if a light is on that shouldn't be, or if you see something moving that doesn't make sense. This building is old, so sometimes the electrical stuff acts up. Motion sensors go off for no reason, that sort of thing. After he left, I settled in for another quiet night. I did my first round at midnight, walking through each floor and checking doors. Everything was normal. The second round at 1 a.m. was the same. By 2 a.m., I was getting into the rhythm of things and feeling pretty comfortable with the job. The sound in the walls. It was during my third week that I first noticed something that didn't seem quite right. I was doing my 3 a.m. round on the fourth floor when I heard what sounded like footsteps coming from somewhere above me. Not loud footsteps, but definitely the sound of someone walking around. I stopped and listened for a moment. The sound continued, slow, deliberate steps moving across what would be the fifth floor. My first thought was that maybe the cleaning crew was working late, even though Dave had said they were usually done by 10 p.m. I decided to head up to the fifth floor and check it out. When I got to the fifth floor, everything was quiet and dark. I flipped on the hallway lights and walked around, checking each office door. All of them were locked, and I didn't see any signs that anyone had been there recently. I stood still and listened again, but the footsteps had stopped. I made a note in the logbook when I got back to the office, just like Dave had suggested. 3:15 a.m. heard possible footsteps on fifth floor. Investigated and found nothing unusual. All doors secure. The rest of that night passed without incident, and I almost forgot about the whole thing by the time my shift ended at 7 a.m. 2 nights later, it happened again. This time I was in the security office when I heard the footsteps, and I could see all the fifth floor camera feeds on the monitors. The cameras showed empty hallways, but I could still hear the walking sounds coming from somewhere up there. I grabbed my flashlight and keys and headed upstairs again. Just like before, by the time I got to the fifth floor, everything was quiet. I did a more thorough check this time, using my keys to actually open some of the office doors and look inside. Nothing was out of place anywhere. Back in the security office, I rewound the camera footage to see if I had missed anything. I watched the feeds from the time I first heard the footsteps, but the cameras didn't show anything unusual, just empty hallways the whole time. I was starting to think maybe the sounds were coming from outside the building, or from the building's heating and cooling system. Old buildings make all kinds of noises, and it was easy to mistake mechanical sounds for footsteps. The pattern emerges. Over the next week, the footsteps became a regular thing. Always between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., always on the fifth floor, and always stopping by the time I got up there to investigate. I started timing it, and it was remarkably consistent. The sounds would start around 3:10 a.m. and last for about 5 to 10 minutes. I mentioned it to Dave when he came in for his evening shift. "Yeah, I've heard about that before," he said, not seeming too concerned. "The guy who worked here before you mentioned something similar. Mr. Peterson thinks it might be related to the HVAC system. Sometimes the air ducts expand and contract, and it can sound like footsteps." That explanation made sense, and it made me feel better about the whole thing. I decided to stop investigating every time I heard the sounds and just make notes in the logbook instead. But then something happened that made it harder to dismiss as just building noises. I was doing my 2 a.m. round on the third floor when I heard the footsteps start up on the fifth floor, about an hour earlier than usual. I decided to ignore it and continue with my rounds, but as I was checking the doors on the third floor, I heard something else, the sound of a door closing somewhere above me. This wasn't the kind of sound that an HVAC system would make. It was definitely the sound of a door being closed, with that distinctive click of the latch catching. I immediately headed up to the fifth floor, taking the stairs 2 at a time. When I got there, I went straight to each office door and tried the handles. They were all still locked, just like they should be. But as I was checking the last door at the end of the hallway, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The door was warm. Not just a little warm, but noticeably warmer than all the other doors I had touched. I put my hand flat against it and could feel heat coming from the other side, like someone had been running a space heater in there. I used my key to unlock the door and pushed it open slowly. The office was dark, and I swept my flashlight beam around the room. It was a small accounting office with a desk, some filing cabinets, and a couple of chairs. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air in the room felt stuffy and warm, like someone had been in there for a while. I checked the thermostat on the wall. It was set to 68 degrees, same as all the other offices. There was no space heater or any other heating equipment that would explain why the room was so warm. I spent about 10 minutes looking around the office, but I didn't find anything that seemed unusual. Eventually, I locked the door and headed back downstairs, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The investigation. The next morning, I decided to do some research about the building. I went to the public library and looked up old newspaper articles and records about the place. What I found made me understand why Dave and the previous guard had both mentioned strange occurrences. The building had a history. Back in 1987, a man named Richard Carver had worked as a night janitor there. According to the newspaper articles I found, Carver had been found dead in one of the fifth-floor offices after he failed to show up for work for 3 days. The cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but what made it strange was that he had been found in an office that was supposed to be locked, with no signs of forced entry. The article mentioned that Carver had been known to sometimes stay in the building after his shift was over, using empty offices to take naps before going home. The theory was that he had been sleeping in the office when he had the heart attack. But what really caught my attention was a detail buried in one of the follow-up articles. Several night shift workers in the months after Carver's death had reported hearing footsteps and other sounds on the 5th floor, always during the early morning hours. The building management had investigated and concluded that the sounds were caused by the building's old heating system, but some of the workers remained convinced that something else was going on. Reading these articles, I realized that the office where I had felt the warm door was probably the same office where Richard Carver had died. The article didn't specify which office it was, but there couldn't be too many coincidences. The confrontation. Armed with this new information, I went into my next shift with a different mindset. Instead of trying to dismiss the sounds as building noises, I decided to pay closer attention and see if I could figure out what was really going on. The night started normally. I did my rounds at midnight and 1 a.m. without incident. At 2 a.m., I was back in the security office when I heard the familiar sound of footsteps starting up on the 5th floor. This time, instead of going upstairs immediately, I watched the security cameras more carefully. I switched between the different 5th floor camera feeds, looking for any movement or changes in the lighting. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. But then, on the camera that showed the hallway where the warm office was located, I noticed something that made me lean forward in my chair. One of the office doors was open. I was sure it had been closed during my 1 a.m. round, but now it was standing wide open. The office was dark, so I couldn't see inside, but the door was definitely open. I grabbed my keys and flashlight and headed upstairs, my heart pounding harder than it had since I started this job. When I got to the 5th floor, I could see the open door at the end of the hallway. It was the same office where I had felt the warm door a few nights earlier. As I approached the office, I could hear something coming from inside. Not footsteps this time, but a different sound, like papers being shuffled or someone going through files. I stopped just outside the doorway and listened. The sounds were definitely coming from inside the office, and they sounded purposeful, like someone was looking for something specific. I took a deep breath and stepped into the doorway, shining my flashlight into the office. The room was empty, but the sounds continued for a few more seconds after I entered, like an echo that was taking time to fade away. And just like before, the air in the room was warm and stuffy. I stood there for several minutes, sweeping my flashlight around the room and listening carefully. The sounds had stopped completely, but I had the strangest feeling that I wasn't alone in the room. The final encounter. I didn't sleep well the next day. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about that empty office and the sounds I had heard coming from inside it. I knew what I had experienced, but I also knew how crazy it would sound if I tried to explain it to anyone. That night, I came to work with a small digital recorder that I had borrowed from a friend. If I was going to experience something supernatural, I wanted to have some kind of proof. The early part of my shift was quiet, but I felt tense and on edge. Every little sound made me jump, and I found myself checking the 5th floor cameras more frequently than usual. At 3:15 a.m., right on schedule, the footsteps started. This time I was ready. I started the digital recorder and placed it on the desk, then switched to the 5th floor camera feeds. Just like the night before, I could see that the office door was standing open. But this time, something was different. As I watched the camera feed, I could see a faint light coming from inside the office, like someone was using a flashlight or working by the light of a computer screen. I grabbed the recorder and my keys and headed upstairs, moving as quietly as possible. When I got to the 5th floor, I could see the light coming from the office at the end of the hall. It was a soft, yellowish glow, like the light from an old desk lamp. I approached the office slowly, holding the recorder in front of me and trying to control my breathing. As I got closer, I could hear the paper shuffling sounds again, but this time they were accompanied by something else, a low muttering like someone talking to themselves. I reached the doorway and peered inside. There was a figure sitting at the desk with his back to me. He was wearing what looked like a janitor's uniform, and he was going through papers and files, occasionally muttering something under his breath. The light was coming from an old desk lamp that definitely hadn't been in the office during any of my previous visits. I stood there frozen, not sure what to do. The figure seemed completely absorbed in whatever he was doing and didn't seem to notice me standing in the doorway. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to whisper, "Excuse me?" The figure stopped moving immediately. The muttering stopped and the room became completely silent. Slowly, very slowly, the figure began to turn around in the chair. I didn't wait to see his face. I turned and ran down the hallway, down the stairs, and didn't stop until I was back in the security office. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, then grabbed the phone to call 911. But as I was dialing, I looked up at the security monitors. The 5th floor camera feed showed an empty hallway. The office door was closed and there was no light coming from inside. I hung up the phone and sat down heavily in the chair, my hands shaking as I tried to process what had just happened. The resolution. I listened to the digital recording the next day. For the first few minutes, you could hear my footsteps and the ambient sounds of the building. But right around the time when I would have reached the 5th floor, the recording picked up the paper shuffling sounds and the muttering just like I had heard. The muttering was too low to make out specific words, but it was definitely there on the recording. And then, right at the moment when I had spoken, everything went silent. I turned in my resignation that afternoon. Mr. Peterson seemed disappointed but not entirely surprised. "These old buildings can get to people," he said. "Sometimes the night shift just isn't a good fit." I didn't try to explain what had really happened. I just thanked him for the opportunity and wished him luck finding a replacement. A few months later, I ran into Dave at a coffee shop downtown. We chatted for a few minutes and eventually the conversation turned to the old job. "How's the new night guard working out?" I asked. Dave's expression got a little uncomfortable. "Actually, we've had a few people quit pretty quickly. Mr. Peterson is thinking about hiring a security company instead of individual guards." He paused and looked at me carefully. "You know, after you left, I started paying more attention during my evening shifts. Sometimes I'll hear those footsteps right before I leave at 11 p.m. And a couple of times, I've seen that office door standing open when I do my final rounds." I nodded but didn't say anything. "I think Richard Carver is still trying to finish his work," Dave said quietly. "Maybe he doesn't realize that he doesn't need to come in anymore." I never found out if Mr. Peterson eventually hired a security company, or if they ever figured out a way to help Richard Carver move on. But I think about that building sometimes, especially on quiet nights when I'm having trouble sleeping. I hope whoever took over that security job was more prepared for what they might encounter than I was. And I hope Richard Carver eventually found whatever he was looking for in those papers. The apartment above. Moving in. I found the apartment through a Craigslist ad that seemed too good to be true. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, decent neighborhood, and the rent was about $300 less than anything else I had looked at. The landlord, Mrs. Chen, seemed nice enough when she showed me around. She was an older woman who lived in the house next door and owned this small apartment building. The previous tenant moved out suddenly, she explained as we walked through the empty rooms. Left most of his furniture behind, which you're welcome to use if you want. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of a 3-story building. Mrs. Chin explained that there was another tenant on the 1st floor, an elderly man named Mr. Rodriguez who kept to himself, and the 3rd floor was currently vacant. "Very quiet building," she assured me. "Mr. Rodriguez goes to bed early, and you won't have any problems with noise." I signed the lease that day and moved in the following weekend. The previous tenant had indeed left behind quite a bit of furniture: a couch, a kitchen table, a bed frame, and several bookshelves. It saved me a lot of money and hassle, so I was grateful for it. The first few weeks in the apartment were great. It was exactly what I needed after living with roommates for the past 3 years. Having my own space felt like such a luxury, and the neighborhood was quiet and safe. I could walk to work, and there were several good restaurants and a grocery store within a few blocks. Mr. Rodriguez turned out to be exactly as Mrs. Chen had described. I'd see him occasionally coming or going, and he'd always nod politely and say hello, but we never had any extended conversations. He seemed like a nice enough guy, probably in his 70s, and he did indeed seem to keep very quiet hours. The third floor. About a month after I moved in, I started hearing sounds coming from the third floor. At first, it was just occasional creaking and settling noises, which I assumed were normal for an old building. But after a few days, the sounds became more frequent and more distinct. It sounded like someone walking around up there. I mentioned it to Mrs. Chen the next time I saw her working in her garden. "Oh, that's probably just the building settling," she said without looking up from her flowers. "These old places make all kinds of noises. You'll get used to it." But the sounds didn't seem like random settling noises to me. They had a pattern, like someone walking from room to room at regular intervals. And they always seemed to happen at night, usually between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. After about a week of this, I decided to ask Mr. Rodriguez if he had noticed the sounds too. I caught him getting his mail one evening and brought up the topic casually. "The third floor?" he said, looking puzzled. "No, I haven't heard anything from up there. But my hearing isn't what it used to be, so maybe I just haven't noticed." He paused and looked up toward the third floor windows. Mrs. Chen did mention that she might be showing the apartment to potential tenants soon. "Maybe that's what you're hearing." That explanation made sense, so I decided not to worry about it. But over the next few days, the sounds continued, and they always seemed to happen at night when Mrs. Chen wouldn't be showing the apartment to anyone. The investigation. One evening, when the walking sounds had been going on for about 20 minutes, I decided to go upstairs and see if I could figure out what was causing them. I had never actually seen the third floor, so I was curious about the layout anyway. The stairway to the third floor was at the end of the hallway outside my apartment door. I had walked past it dozens of times but had never paid much attention to it. The stairs were old and creaky, and there was a door at the top that I assumed led to the third floor apartment. When I got to the top of the stairs, I found that the door was slightly open. Not wide open, but open enough that I could see it wasn't completely closed. I knocked gently and called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" There was no response, but the walking sounds had stopped as soon as I reached the top of the stairs. I pushed the door open a little wider and peered inside. The apartment was dark, but I could see that it had a similar layout to mine, a living room, kitchen, and what looked like a hallway leading to the bedrooms. "Hello?" I called out again, a little louder this time. Still no response. I used my phone's flashlight to look around the living room. Unlike my apartment, this one was completely empty. No furniture, no belongings, nothing. Just bare walls and hardwood floors. I walked through the apartment quickly, checking each room. All of them were empty, and there was no sign that anyone had been there recently. The air smelled stale and dusty, like the place had been vacant for a long time. But as I was leaving, I noticed something that made me pause. There were footprints in the dust on the floor. Not a lot of them, but enough to show that someone had been walking around the apartment recently. The footprints seemed to follow a specific path, from the living room to the kitchen, then down the hallway to the bedrooms, then back to the living room. It was almost like someone had been doing regular patrols or walks through the apartment, asking questions. The next day, I decided to ask Mrs. Chen about the third floor more directly. I found her working in her garden again and brought up the topic. "Mrs. Chen, I heard some sounds coming from the third floor last night, so I went up to check. The door was open, and I looked around to make sure everything was okay." She stopped what she was doing and looked at me with a concerned expression. "The door was open? That's strange. I always keep it locked when I'm not showing it to potential tenants." "Have you been showing it recently?" I asked. "No, not for several weeks. I've been meaning to advertise it, but I've been too busy with other things." She stood up and brushed the dirt off her hands. "Let me go check on it. Maybe the lock is acting up." We walked over to the building together, and Mrs. Chen pulled out a set of keys as we climbed the stairs to the third floor. When we got to the door, it was closed and locked. "That's odd," she said as she unlocked it. "I was sure I locked it the last time I was up here." She opened the door and we both looked inside. The apartment looked exactly as it had the night before, empty and dusty. "Everything looks normal," Mrs. Chen said, but I could tell she was puzzled by the situation. I didn't mention the footprints in the dust. I wasn't sure if they would still be there, and I didn't want to make Mrs. Chen think I had been snooping around more than necessary. "I'll make sure to keep it locked from now on," she said as we headed back downstairs. Old buildings sometimes have issues with doors not latching properly. The pattern continues. Despite Mrs. Chen's assurance that she would keep the third floor locked, the sounds continued. Every night around the same time, I would hear the distinctive sound of footsteps moving through the apartment above me. But now I knew for certain that the apartment was supposed to be empty and locked. So either someone had a key and was getting in somehow, or something else was going on. I started paying closer attention to the pattern of the sounds. They always started around 10 p.m. and would continue for anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour. The footsteps seemed to follow the same route each time, starting in what would be the living room, moving to the kitchen, then down the hallway to the bedrooms and back again. It was like someone was doing a nightly routine, checking on things or patrolling the apartment. After about a week of this, I decided to try something. The next time I heard the footsteps start, I went upstairs and tried the door handle. It was locked, just as Mrs. Chen had promised it would be. But the footsteps were still clearly audible from inside the apartment. I put my ear to the door and listened carefully. The sounds were definitely coming from inside, and they sounded like they were just a few feet away from where I was standing. I knocked on the door, not really expecting a response but curious to see what would happen. The footsteps stopped immediately. I waited for several minutes, but the sounds didn't resume. When I went back to my apartment, the rest of the night was quiet. The previous tenant. The next day, I decided to do some research. Mrs. Chen had mentioned that the previous tenant in my apartment had left suddenly, and I was curious about whether there might be a connection to the sounds I was hearing. I started by asking around the neighborhood. There was a small coffee shop a few blocks away where I had become a regular customer, and the owner, Maria, seemed to know a lot about the local area. "Oh, you're living in Mrs. Chen's building now," she said when I mentioned my address. "That's a nice place. I remember the guy who used to live there before you. Kevin something. He came in here pretty regularly. Do you know why he moved out?" I asked. Maria's expression became a little more serious. Actually, it was kind of sad. He told me he was having trouble sleeping because of noises coming from upstairs. Said it sounded like someone walking around at night, but Mrs. Chen insisted the third floor was empty. She paused to serve another customer, then continued our conversation. Kevin seemed like a pretty level-headed guy, not the type to make up stories or get spooked easily. But he said the sounds were driving him crazy, and he couldn't get a good night's sleep. He ended up breaking his lease and moving out after only a few months. This information made me feel both better and worse. Better because it confirmed that I wasn't imagining the sounds, but worse because it suggested that whatever was causing them wasn't going away anytime soon. Did he ever figure out what was causing the sounds? I asked. Not that I know of. He seemed pretty frustrated about the whole thing when he left. The history. That afternoon, I decided to visit the local library and see if I could find any information about the building or the neighborhood that might explain what was going on. The librarian was helpful and showed me how to access old newspaper archives and city records. I started by searching for the address of my building and seeing what came up. What I found was more interesting than I had expected. The building had been constructed in the 1940s as a single-family home, but it had been converted into apartments sometime in the 1980s. The conversion had been done by the previous owner, a man named Harold Griggs, who had lived in the house with his wife until she passed away in 1979. According to the newspaper articles I found, Harold had decided to convert the house into rental units as a way to generate income and avoid having to sell the family home. He had continued to live in what was now the third-floor apartment while renting out the other 2 floors. But in 1995, Harold had been found dead in the third-floor apartment. The cause of death was listed as natural causes. He had been in his 70s and had a history of heart problems. But what caught my attention was the circumstances of his death. According to the article, Harold's tenants had been concerned because they hadn't seen him for several days, which was unusual since he typically checked on the building and collected rent in person each month. When they asked Mrs. Chin, who had been a neighbor even then, to check on him, she had found his body in the third-floor apartment. The article mentioned that Harold had been known for his nightly routine of walking through the building to check on things and make sure everything was secure. He would typically do this walk around 10 p.m. each night, checking each floor methodically before returning to his own apartment. The realization. Reading about Harold Griggs and his nightly routine, everything suddenly made sense. The footsteps I was hearing followed the exact pattern that Harold would have used when he was alive, starting in his living room, checking the kitchen, then the bedrooms, and returning to the living room. and the timing was consistent with what the article had described as his usual routine. I realized that what I was experiencing wasn't someone breaking into the third-floor apartment or Mrs. Chen secretly showing it to tenants. It was Harold, still following his nightly routine more than 25 years after his death. The knowledge should have been frightening, but somehow it wasn't. Harold had been the owner of the building, and he had clearly cared about maintaining it and keeping his tenants safe. If his spirit was still there, it seemed like he was just continuing to do what he had always done, making sure everything was okay. But understanding what was happening didn't make the nightly sounds any less disruptive to my sleep. The solution. I decided to try something that might sound crazy to most people, but it made sense to me given what I had learned about Harold. The next time I heard the footsteps start their nightly routine, I went upstairs and knocked gently on the door. "Mr. Griggs?" I said quietly. "My name is David. I'm living in the second-floor apartment now." The footsteps stopped immediately. "I know you're just checking on the building, and I appreciate that you care about keeping this place safe. But the walking sounds are making it hard for me to sleep, and I think they bothered the previous tenant too." I felt a little foolish talking to an empty hallway, but I continued. "Everything is okay down here. Mrs. Chin takes good care of the building, and Mr. Rodriguez and I are both quiet, responsible tenants. You don't need to worry about us." I paused, not sure what else to say. "Maybe you could do your rounds a little earlier in the evening, before I go to bed? That way you can still check on things, but it won't keep me awake." I waited for a few minutes, but there was no response and no more sounds from inside the apartment. I went back downstairs and went to bed. The next night, I heard the footsteps start around 8 p.m. instead of 10 p.m. They followed the same pattern as always, but they were finished well before my usual bedtime. The new routine. Over the next few weeks, Harold seemed to adjust his routine to accommodate my schedule. The nightly walks continued, but they consistently happened earlier in the evening when they were less disruptive. I never saw any physical sign of Harold's presence, and the third-floor apartment remained locked and empty whenever Mrs. Chen or I checked on it. But the footsteps continued their regular pattern, and I grew comfortable with the knowledge that the building's former owner was still keeping an eye on things. A few months later, Mrs. Chin mentioned that she was thinking about renovating the third-floor apartment and putting it back on the rental market. "I haven't had much interest in it lately," she said. "Maybe if I update it a bit, it will be more appealing to potential tenants." I thought about Harold and wondered how he would feel about having a new tenant in his old apartment. But I decided not to mention anything to Mrs. Chen. If she wanted to rent out the third floor, that was her decision to make. The renovation took about 6 weeks. During that time, the nightly footsteps stopped completely. I assumed that Harold was probably not comfortable with all the construction workers and changes being made to his space. But once the renovation was finished and the workers were gone, the footsteps resumed their regular schedule. The new tenant. Mrs. Chin found a tenant for the third floor pretty quickly after the renovation was completed. Her name was Sarah, and she seemed like a nice person when I met her in the hallway. She was about my age and worked as a graphic designer, mostly from home. I was curious about whether Sarah would experience anything unusual in Harold's old apartment, but I didn't want to say anything that might scare her or make her think I was crazy. For the first few weeks after Sarah moved in, everything seemed normal. I didn't hear the nightly footsteps anymore, which made sense since Harold's apartment was now occupied by a living person. But about a month after Sarah moved in, I ran into her at the coffee shop where I had first learned about Kevin, my predecessor in the second-floor apartment. "How are you settling into the new place?" I asked. Sarah hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's a great apartment, and Mrs. Chin is a wonderful landlord. But I have to ask you something, and I hope you don't think I'm crazy." "What's that?" "Do you ever hear footsteps in the building at night? It sounds like someone walking around, but it doesn't seem to be coming from your apartment or Mr. Rodriguez's." I realized that Harold was probably continuing his nightly routine, but now that Sarah was living in his apartment, she was experiencing it from the inside rather than hearing it from below. "Actually," I said carefully, "I used to hear similar sounds before you moved in. I think it might be related to the history of the building." I told Sarah about Harold Griggs and what I had learned about his nightly routine. I explained my theory about why the footsteps continued and how I had managed to work out a compromise that made them less disruptive. Sarah listened to everything I said with a thoughtful expression. "That actually makes a lot of sense," she said finally. "The footsteps seem to follow a very specific pattern, like someone doing rounds. And they're not threatening or scary, just persistent. She paused to take a sip of her coffee. Do you think I should try talking to him like you did? It couldn't hurt, I said. Harold seems like he was a reasonable person when he was alive. Maybe he just needs to know that you're okay with him being there. The understanding. A few days later, Sarah told me that she had tried talking to Harold during one of his nightly walks. I just explained that I was the new tenant and that I appreciated him watching out for the building, she said. I told him that I felt safe knowing he was still around, but asked if he could maybe be a little quieter during his rounds. How did it go? I asked. Well, the footsteps are still there, but they're much softer now. And sometimes I get the feeling that he's checking to make sure I'm okay, especially if I'm working late or if I seem upset about something. Sarah had apparently developed a much more direct relationship with Harold than I ever had. She would occasionally mention little things like how her apartment door would be locked in the morning even if she had forgotten to lock it the night before, or how she would sometimes find that a window she had left open during a rainstorm had been mysteriously closed. I think he's actually a very considerate roommate, she said with a laugh. Better than some of the living people I've shared space with. The community. Word about Harold's presence in the building eventually spread to Mr. Rodriguez as well. It turned out that he had been aware of the situation for years but had never mentioned it because he didn't think anyone would believe him. I've lived here for 15 years, he told Sarah and me during a conversation in the building's small lobby. Harold was a good man when he was alive, and he's been a good presence to have around even after he passed. Mr. Rodriguez explained that Harold had helped him through a difficult period several years earlier when he had been recovering from surgery and was having trouble getting around. I would find that my newspaper was always brought inside my door, even though I hadn't asked anyone to do it, he said, and my mail was always neatly organized on my kitchen table. Harold was looking out for me. It was comforting to know that Harold's presence was actually beneficial rather than just neutral. He wasn't just going through the motions of his old routine, he was actively caring for the people who lived in his building. Mrs. Chen's perspective. Eventually, Sarah decided to mention Harold to Mrs. Chen. She was worried that the landlord might think she was making up stories or trying to break her lease, but she felt like Mrs. Chen deserved to know what was happening in her building. Mrs. Chen's reaction was not what any of us expected. "Oh, you've met Harold," she said matter-of-factly. "I was wondering when he would introduce himself to you." It turned out that Mrs. Chen had been aware of Harold's presence for years. She had been his neighbor when he was alive, and she had noticed signs of his continued presence shortly after his death. Harold was always very protective of this building and the people who lived here, she explained. When I inherited the property from his estate, I made a promise to him that I would take good care of it. I think he's just making sure I keep that promise. Mrs. Chen admitted that she had been reluctant to tell tenants about Harold because she was afraid it would scare people away. But she had noticed that the tenants who stayed longest were usually the ones who somehow became aware of Harold and learned to coexist with him. Kevin, your predecessor, never could get comfortable with the idea, she told me. But you three seem to understand that Harold is part of what makes this building special. The resolution. It's been about 2 years now since I first started hearing the footsteps from the 3rd floor. Harold is still there, still doing his nightly rounds, still watching out for the building and its residents. Sarah and I have both grown accustomed to his presence, and we sometimes joke that we have the most dedicated building superintendent in the city. Mr. Rodriguez continues to benefit from Harold's quiet assistance with small daily tasks. Mrs. Chen has stopped worrying about finding tenants who will be comfortable with the building's unique situation. She now includes a brief mention of Harold in her rental listings, describing him as a beneficial presence who helps maintain building security. Surprisingly, this approach has actually attracted tenants rather than scaring them away. Apparently, there are more people than you might expect who are interested in living somewhere with a friendly ghost. I've learned a lot from living in this building. Mainly, I've learned that not all unexplained phenomena are frightening or harmful. Sometimes they're just reminders that care and concern can persist even after death, and that a sense of responsibility doesn't always end when life does. I'm planning to renew my lease for another year. The rent is still reasonable, the neighborhood is great, and I've grown fond of knowing that Harold is keeping an eye on things. And honestly, in a world where it's sometimes hard to find people who genuinely care about your well-being, it's comforting to know that Harold Griggs is still looking out for the residents of his building, more than 25 years after he passed away. The highway rest stop. The long drive home. I was driving back from my sister's wedding in Colorado, a trip that should have taken me about 8 hours but was turning into much longer because of road construction and heavy traffic. It was late October and I had been on the road since early morning, but I was still only about halfway home. By the time evening started to fall, I was getting pretty tired. I had been driving for almost 10 hours with only a couple of short breaks, and my back was starting to ache from sitting in the same position for so long. The weather had also started to turn. What had been a clear, sunny day was now overcast and getting colder. I was driving through a particularly remote stretch of highway, the kind where you might go 20 or 30 miles without seeing anything except farmland and the occasional truck stop. The traffic had finally thinned out, which was a relief, but it also meant that if I had car trouble or needed help, I might be waiting a while for assistance. Around 7 p.m., I saw a sign for a rest area coming up in 2 miles. I decided to stop and take a break, maybe get some coffee and stretch my legs before continuing the drive. I figured I had at least 3 more hours of driving ahead of me, and I wanted to make sure I was alert for the rest of the trip. The rest area was one of those older highway facilities that had probably been built in the 1970s or 1980s. It had a small building with restrooms and vending machines, a few picnic tables, and a parking area that could accommodate maybe 20 cars. There were tall trees surrounding most of the area, which made it feel isolated from the highway even though you could still hear the occasional truck passing by. When I pulled into the parking area, there were only 2 other vehicles there, a semi-truck parked at the far end near the truck parking spaces, and an older sedan parked close to the building. The other travelers. I parked near the building and got out to stretch. The air was much cooler than it had been when I started driving that morning, and I could smell rain in the air. I decided to use the restroom and get something from the vending machines before getting back on the road. The building was typical for highway rest areas, concrete block construction, fluorescent lighting, and that slightly institutional smell that comes from industrial cleaning products. The men's restroom was clean but basic, and I was glad to have a few minutes to wash my face and feel a bit more refreshed. When I came out of the restroom, I noticed that the person from the sedan was standing near the vending machines. It was an older man, probably in his 60s, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He was studying the snack options with the focused attention of someone who was really hungry. "Long drive?" I asked as I approached the machines. He looked up and smiled. "Yeah, I'm heading back to Kansas City from visiting my daughter in Denver." "You?" "Similar situation. Coming back from my sister's wedding in Colorado Springs." We chatted for a few minutes about the drive and the weather while I got a Coke and a bag of chips from the vending machine. His name was Frank and he seemed like a nice enough guy, the kind of person you might sit next to on an airplane and have a pleasant conversation with. "I was thinking about pushing through and trying to get home tonight," Frank said. "But this weather looks like it might get nasty. Might be smarter to find a motel somewhere and finish the drive tomorrow." I looked outside through the building's windows. The sky had gotten significantly darker in just the few minutes we had been inside, and I could see lightning flashing in the distance. "Yeah, I'm thinking the same thing," I said. "Better safe than sorry." The storm. We were still talking when the rain started. At first, it was just a light drizzle, but within a few minutes it had turned into a heavy downpour. The wind picked up too, and we could hear it howling around the building. "Wow, that came up fast," Frank said, looking out at the parking lot where the rain was now coming down so hard that it was difficult to see our cars clearly. I checked the weather app on my phone, but the signal was weak and it was taking a long time to load. When it finally did, the radar showed a large storm system moving through the area, with heavy rain and possible severe weather expected for the next several hours. "Looks like we might be stuck here for a while," I said, showing Frank the radar image. "Could be worse places to wait out a storm," he replied, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. We settled in to wait, sitting at one of the few chairs near the vending machines. The building had large windows facing the parking area, so we could watch the storm and keep an eye on our vehicles. The rain continued to get heavier, and the wind was strong enough that we could hear branches breaking in the trees around the rest area. Every few minutes, lightning would illuminate the entire area with a bright flash, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the building. After about 30 minutes, the semi-truck that had been parked at the far end of the lot started up and pulled out onto the highway, disappearing into the storm. The truck driver had apparently decided to risk driving in the bad weather rather than waiting it out. "Hope he knows what he's doing," Frank said, watching the truck's taillights disappear into the rain. The arrival. We had been waiting for about an hour when another vehicle pulled into the rest area. Through the rain and darkness, it was hard to see what kind of car it was, but it parked near the building and someone got out and ran toward the entrance. The door opened and a woman came in, soaking wet despite the short run from her car. She was probably in her 40s, with dark hair that was now plastered to her head from the rain. "Terrible weather out there," she said, shaking water off her jacket. I couldn't see more than 20 feet in front of my car, so I figured I'd better pull over until this passes. Frank and I introduced ourselves and the woman said her name was Linda. She was driving from Oklahoma City to visit her mother in Wyoming, a trip she made several times a year. "I've been through plenty of storms on this highway," she said, "but this one seems particularly nasty. The wind almost pushed me off the road a couple of times." Linda got some coffee from one of the vending machines and joined us near the windows. The three of us sat there watching the storm and making small talk about our respective trips. It was actually kind of pleasant in a way. There's something about being stuck somewhere with strangers that can lead to interesting conversations. We talked about our families, our jobs, places we had traveled. Frank turned out to be a retired high school teacher, and Linda worked for a non-profit organization that helped veterans find housing. The problem: after we had been sitting there for about 2 hours, Linda got up to use the restroom. Frank and I continued watching the storm, which seemed to be getting worse rather than better. "You know," Frank said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" When Linda first came in, she said she was driving from Oklahoma City to Wyoming to visit her mother. "Yeah, I remember." Frank was quiet for a moment, looking out at the rain. "But a little while ago, when we were talking about the different routes we take, she mentioned that she lives in Denver and was heading back there from visiting family in Texas." I thought about this for a moment. It was possible that Linda had misspoken or that I had misheard something, but Frank was right. The two stories didn't match up. "Maybe she made a mistake," I said. "Easy to get confused when you're tired and stressed about the weather." "Maybe," Frank said, but he sounded uncertain. When Linda came back from the restroom, she seemed different somehow. She was quieter and kept looking out the windows, not at the storm but at the parking lot, like she was watching for something. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Oh yes, fine," she said quickly. "Just hoping this storm passes soon so we can all get back on the road." But she continued to seem distracted and nervous. She would start to say something, then stop mid-sentence and look toward the windows again. The realization. Around 10 p.m., the storm finally started to ease up. The rain was still falling, but it was lighter, and the wind had died down significantly. Frank and I were discussing whether it was safe to start driving again when Linda suddenly stood up. "I think I'm going to try to make it to the next town," she said. "There should be a motel there where I can spend the night." "Are you sure?" I asked. "The roads are probably still pretty slick." "I'll be careful," she said, gathering up her things. "It was nice meeting you both." She headed toward the door, then stopped and turned back to us. "You two should probably get going soon too. It's not safe to stay in one place too long on a night like this." There was something about the way she said it that made me feel uneasy. It wasn't advice about the weather or road conditions. It sounded more like a warning. After Linda left, Frank and I sat in silence for a few minutes, both of us processing what had just happened. "That was strange," Frank said finally. "Yeah, it was." "What do you think she meant about not staying in one place too long?" "I don't know, but I'm starting to think maybe we should listen to her." I looked out at the parking lot. Linda's car was gone, and the area looked empty and somehow more isolated than it had before. The storm clouds were clearing, but there was no moon, so the area beyond the building's lights was completely dark. The discovery. We decided to wait another 30 minutes to make sure the roads were safe, then head out to find motels in the next town. But as we were getting ready to leave, Frank noticed something that made us both freeze. "Look at the guest registry," he said, pointing to a book near the building's entrance that visitors were supposed to sign. I walked over to look at it. The book had entries from various travelers over the past few days, including our names and the time we had arrived. But there was no entry for Linda. "Maybe she just forgot to sign it," I said. "Maybe," Frank said, but he was looking at something else now. "But look at this." He was pointing to an entry from 3 days earlier. The handwriting was different, but the name was the same, Linda Morrison. According to the entry, Linda Morrison had stopped at this rest area 3 days ago around the same time of night. The entry included a note, "Waited out severe weather. Left around 11 p.m. "That's got to be a coincidence," I said. Same name but different person. Frank flipped back through several pages of the registry. What we found made my blood run cold. Linda Morrison had signed the registry at this rest area multiple times over the past several months. Always late at night, always during bad weather, always with a note about waiting out storms. The pattern. Looking through the registry more carefully, we found Linda Morrison's signature going back over 2 years. The entries were sporadic, sometimes weeks or months apart, but they were consistent in their timing and circumstances. October 15th, waited out thunderstorm. September 3rd, severe weather, delayed departure. July 22nd, heavy rain, stayed until safe to drive. The pattern was always the same. Linda Morrison would arrive during severe weather, wait for the storm to pass, then leave around 11 p.m. This is impossible, I said. Even if it's the same person, why would she be stopping at this exact same rest area so frequently? And why would she lie about where she was going? Frank was studying the signatures more closely. Look at the handwriting, he said. It's identical in every entry. Not just similar, identical. The same exact curves and slants. He was right. The signatures weren't just from the same person. They looked like they had been written by the same hand on the same day, with the same pen, in the same mood. I think we need to leave, Frank said quietly. Right now. The departure. We gathered our things quickly and headed for the door. As we stepped outside, the air felt different, not just from the passing storm, but charged with something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Our cars were the only vehicles in the parking lot, parked exactly where we had left them. But as we walked toward them, I noticed tire tracks in the wet pavement that didn't match either of our vehicles. The tracks were from a smaller car, and they showed where a vehicle had pulled into the lot, parked near the building, and then left again. But here's what was strange. The tracks showed the car arriving, but there were no tracks showing it leaving. It was like the car had simply vanished from its parking spot. Frank, I said, pointing to the tire tracks. Look at this. He followed my gaze and saw what I was seeing. For a moment, neither of us said anything. We need to go, he said finally. Now. We quickly got into our respective cars and started the engines. As I was backing out of my parking space, I looked back at the building through my rearview mirror. There was a figure standing in the window watching us leave. It was Linda. The highway. I followed Frank out of the rest area and back onto the highway. The roads were still wet, but the visibility had improved significantly. We drove in convoy for about 10 miles, then pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour truck stop to collect ourselves and figure out what to do next. Did you see her in the window? Frank asked as soon as we got out of our cars. Yeah, I saw her. But that's impossible. We watched her car leave. I know what I saw, Frank said firmly. And I know what we found in that registry book. We went into the truck stop and got coffee, trying to process what had just happened. The place was bright and noisy and full of people, which was exactly what we needed after the isolated strangeness of the rest area. So what do we think happened back there? I asked. Frank shook his head slowly. I don't know. But I think that woman Linda, or whoever she was trying to warn us about something. Remember what she said about not staying in one place too long? You think she was protecting us from something? Or someone? We sat in silence for a few minutes, drinking our coffee and watching the normal activity of the truck stop. Drivers coming and going, people getting food and supplies, the routine business of highway travel. It all seemed so ordinary and safe compared to what we had just experienced. The investigation. When I got home the next day, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened at the rest area. I decided to do some research and see if I could find any information about accidents or incidents at that location. What I found made me understand why Linda had warned us to leave. Over the past 5 years, there had been several incidents at that rest area involving lone travelers who had stopped there during bad weather. In each case, the traveler had been found dead in their vehicle the next morning, with no apparent cause of death. The victims were always people who were traveling alone, and they were always found during the early morning hours after severe weather had passed through the area. In each case, the person appeared to have died peacefully in their sleep, with no signs of violence or struggle. The local police had investigated each incident thoroughly, but they had never been able to determine a cause of death or identify any common factors beyond the location and weather conditions. But reading through the news reports, I noticed something that the police had apparently missed. In several cases, witnesses reported seeing the victim talking to a woman at the rest area earlier in the evening. The woman was described as being in her 40s with dark hair, driving a small sedan. The witnesses all said the woman had seemed friendly and helpful, offering advice about road conditions and weather. In each case, the woman had left before the victim was found dead. The understanding. I called Frank and shared what I had learned from my research. He listened quietly as I read him the news reports and described the pattern I had discovered. "So you think Linda was the woman that people saw with the victims?" he asked. "I think Linda has been trying to warn people about that rest area for years," I said. "I think she died there herself, under the same circumstances as those other travelers. And now she appears during storms to try to prevent other people from staying there too long. That's my theory. She told us not to stay in one place too long on a night like that. She was trying to protect us from whatever killed her and those other people." Frank was quiet for a long moment. "But what actually killed them?" "The news report said there was no apparent cause of death." "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe we don't want to know." The decision. After our conversation, Frank and I agreed that we should report what we had experienced to the local authorities. We called the state police and told them about Linda's repeated appearances in the rest area registry and about the pattern we had discovered in the news reports. The officer we spoke to was polite but skeptical. He took down our information and said he would pass it along to the appropriate investigators, but it was clear that he didn't take our story very seriously. A few weeks later, I called back to follow up. The officer told me that they had checked the registry book at the rest area, but they hadn't found any entries for Linda Morrison. "Are you sure you were looking at the right book?" I asked. "We checked thoroughly," he said. "There's no record of anyone by that name signing the registry at that location." I wasn't surprised by this response, but I was disappointed. Frank and I had both seen the entries clearly, but apparently the evidence had somehow disappeared. The warning. Despite the police's lack of interest in our story, Frank and I decided to spread the word about the rest area through online travel forums and social media. We shared our experience and the information we had discovered about the previous incidents, hoping to warn other travelers about the potential danger. The response was mixed. Some people thanked us for the warning and said they would avoid that rest area, especially during bad weather. Others dismissed our story as a hoax or an attempt to generate clicks and attention. But a few people reached out to us privately with their own experiences. They had stopped at the same rest area during storms and had encountered a woman matching Linda's description. In each case, the woman had convinced them to leave before spending the night there. One person told us that Linda had approached them directly and said, "You don't want to sleep here tonight. Trust me on this." Another person said Linda had told them about a motel in the next town that had availability, information that turned out to be accurate and possibly life-saving. The legacy. It's been about 3 years now since Frank and I encountered Linda at the highway rest area. We've kept in touch, and we both continue to research incidents at that location and similar places along the highway system. We've learned that there are more locations like this than most people realize, places where lone travelers have died under mysterious circumstances, often during severe weather. And in many cases, there are reports of helpful strangers who appear during storms to warn people away from these dangerous locations. I've changed my travel habits significantly since that night. I avoid stopping at isolated rest areas during bad weather, and I always try to travel with a companion when possible. When I do have to stop somewhere remote, I make sure to leave before dark. Frank has become something of an expert on highway safety and supernatural encounters. He's compiled a database of dangerous rest areas and has created a website to help travelers avoid them. But most importantly, we both understand now that not all encounters with the unexplained are meant to harm us. Sometimes, as in Linda's case, they're meant to protect us. Linda Morrison may have died at that rest area years ago, but her spirit continues to watch over travelers and try to prevent them from suffering the same fate she did. She appears during storms to warn people, to convince them to keep moving, to make sure they don't become another unexplained casualty of that dangerous stretch of highway. I hope that wherever Linda is now, she knows that her warnings have saved lives. Frank and I are certainly grateful that she took the time to protect two strangers on a stormy night, even though it meant revealing her own tragic story. And I hope that other travelers will heed the warnings of helpful strangers who appear during bad weather, especially at isolated rest stops. Sometimes the person trying to help you is someone who learned the hard way that some places are not safe to spend the night. The night shift nurse. The new assignment. I started working as a night shift nurse at Mercy General Hospital in September of 2019. It wasn't my first choice for a position, but the pay was good and they were desperate for night staff, so they offered me a signing bonus that I couldn't really afford to turn down. Night shift nursing is different from day shift in a lot of ways. The hospital is much quieter, with fewer staff members and minimal visitor traffic. Most patients are sleeping, so your main responsibilities are monitoring vital signs, administering medications on schedule, and responding to emergencies. It can be peaceful, but it can also be isolating. My assigned floor was the 7th floor, which housed the general medical ward. We typically had between 20 and 30 patients on any given night, with conditions ranging from post-surgical recovery to chronic illness management. The floor had a typical hospital layout, a central nurses' station surrounded by patient rooms, with supply closets, medication rooms, and staff break areas scattered throughout. The other night shift nurses were friendly enough, but most of them had been working there for years and had established routines and friendships that I wasn't immediately part of. My supervisor, Carol, was a veteran nurse who had been working nights for over 15 years. She was efficient and knowledgeable, but not particularly warm or welcoming to new staff. The most important thing on night shift, Carol told me during my orientation, is to maintain the peace and quiet that patients need to rest and recover. We keep noise to a minimum, we handle problems quickly and discreetly, and we always remember that our patients are at their most vulnerable during the night hours. The first week. My first week on the 7th floor went smoothly. I was paired with an experienced nurse named Jennifer who showed me the routines and helped me get familiar with the layout and the regular patients. Most of the patients were elderly, and many of them had been on the floor for extended stays due to complex medical conditions. Jennifer was easy to work with and seemed to genuinely care about both the patients and the newer staff members. She had been working night shifts for about 5 years and had developed strategies for staying alert and managing the sometimes monotonous pace of overnight hospital work. The hardest part isn't the medical stuff, she told me as we did rounds on my 3rd night. It's the psychological aspect. Being awake all night, dealing with people who are scared and in pain, watching over patients who might not make it until morning. It takes a certain kind of person to handle this work long term. During that first week, I learned the personalities and needs of our regular patients. There was Mrs. Patterson, an 82-year-old woman recovering from hip surgery who had trouble sleeping and liked to talk whenever a nurse came to check on her. There was Mr. Kim, a diabetic man in his 70s who was dealing with complications from his condition and required frequent monitoring. And there were several other patients with various conditions who had been on the floor for weeks or even months. Room 712 was empty during my first week, which Jennifer mentioned was unusual. That room is almost always occupied, she said. But we had a patient discharge yesterday, and no one new has been admitted yet. It's actually kind of nice to have one less room to worry about. The assignment. On my 2nd week, I was assigned to work independently for the first time. Jennifer was still on the floor, but she was handling a different section of patients, and I was responsible for rooms 705 through 720 on my own. It felt good to have my own assignment and to start building relationships with patients without having someone looking over my shoulder constantly. The work was challenging but manageable, and I was starting to feel like I might actually enjoy night shift nursing. On Tuesday night of that week, room 712 was assigned a new patient. According to the chart, her name was Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, and she was 78 years old and being treated for pneumonia. The notes indicated that she had been transferred from another hospital and that her condition was stable but required monitoring. When I went into room 712 to introduce myself and do the initial assessment, I found Mrs. Hartwell sitting up in bed, looking alert and comfortable despite her illness. "You must be the new nurse," she said with a warm smile. Jennifer told me they had hired someone new for the night shift. "That's right, I'm Amanda," I said. "How are you feeling tonight, Mrs. Hartwell?" "Please call me Eleanor. And I'm feeling much better than I was a few days ago. The antibiotics seem to be working and I'm hoping to go home soon." Eleanor was one of those patients who immediately put you at ease. She was friendly without being demanding, grateful for care without being overly effusive, and she had a sense of humor that made the routine tasks of nursing feel less clinical. Over the next few nights, I looked forward to checking on Eleanor. She was always awake when I came in for vital signs or medication administration, and she would often ask about my day or tell me stories about her family and her younger years. The conversations. Eleanor had been a school teacher for 40 years before retiring, and she had a gift for conversation that I imagine had served her well in the classroom. She could make even the most mundane topics interesting, and she had a way of asking questions that made you want to share more than you normally would with a patient. "Tell me about what made you want to be a nurse," she said during one of my visits. I found myself explaining how I had originally planned to be a teacher, like her, but had changed my mind after volunteering at a hospital during college. I told her about the satisfaction I got from helping people during difficult times and how I felt like nursing was a way to make a real difference in people's lives. "That's wonderful," Eleanor said. "It's important to find work that feels meaningful. I always told my students that the most important thing was to find something they cared about and then figure out how to make a living doing it." Eleanor also told me about her family, her late husband who had been a carpenter, her 2 children who lived in other states, and her 4 grandchildren who she clearly adored. She showed me pictures and shared stories about family vacations and holidays. But there was something about Eleanor that puzzled me. Despite being admitted for pneumonia, she never seemed to have any of the symptoms I would expect to see. She wasn't coughing, she didn't seem to have trouble breathing, and her energy level was remarkably high for someone who was supposed to be recovering from a serious respiratory infection. The medical records. After about a week of caring for Eleanor, my curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to look more closely at her medical records. What I found was confusing and somewhat concerning. According to the chart, Eleanor had been admitted with severe pneumonia and had been on oxygen support when she arrived. But the nursing notes from the day shift didn't mention any oxygen use, and the vital signs recorded throughout her stay were completely normal. More puzzling was the fact that there were no records of Eleanor being transferred from another hospital, despite what I had been told when she was first admitted. According to the computer system, she had been admitted directly to our hospital, but there was no record of her being seen in the emergency department or being admitted through any of the normal channels. I decided to ask Jennifer about Eleanor's case the next time I saw her. "Oh, Mrs. Hartwell in 712, Jennifer said when I brought up the subject. "Yes, she's been here for a while now. Nice lady. How long has she been here?" I asked. "Her chart says she was admitted last week, but some of the nurses talk about her like she's been here much longer." Jennifer looked puzzled. "I'm not sure actually. It seems like she's been here forever, but you're right that the chart shows a recent admission date. Maybe there was an error in the computer system when she was readmitted." "Readmitted?" "Yeah, Mrs. Hartwell has been in and out of the hospital several times over the past year or so. She has some chronic health issues that sometimes flare up. The staff all know her pretty well." This explanation made some sense, but it didn't resolve my questions about the inconsistencies in her medical records. The investigation. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to Eleanor's case and asking subtle questions of other staff members. What I discovered was even more confusing than what I had found in the medical records. Some of the nurses talked about Eleanor as if she had been a patient on the floor for months or even years. They would mention things she had said or done during previous stays, and they spoke about her with the familiarity that comes from long-term relationships. But other staff members, particularly newer employees, didn't seem to know Eleanor at all. When I mentioned her name, they would look confused and ask which patient I was talking about. The day shift nurses seemed to have no record of Eleanor being on their patient assignments. When I tried to get information about her care during the day hours, I was told that there was no patient by that name on the floor during the day shift. "Are you sure you have the right room number?" one of the day nurses asked me. "Room 712 has been empty for several weeks now. But I knew for certain that Eleanor was in room 712 every night when I came to work. I checked on her multiple times during each shift, administered her medications, and had long conversations with her." The test. I decided to conduct a simple test to see if I could figure out what was happening with Eleanor's case. On Thursday night, I brought a small digital camera with me to work, the kind that prints instant photos. I planned to take a picture of Eleanor and show it to the day shift nurses to see if they recognized her. When I went into room 712 that night, Eleanor was sitting up in bed reading a book, just as she had been every other night. "Good evening, Eleanor," I said. "How are you feeling tonight?" "Oh, hello, Amanda. I'm doing well, thank you. Just catching up on some reading." I chatted with her for a few minutes, then casually mentioned that I liked to take photos of patients who were doing well in their recovery with their permission to share with family members who couldn't visit. "Would it be okay if I took a quick photo of you?" I asked. Eleanor's expression changed slightly. For just a moment, she looked uncertain, almost worried. "I'm not really comfortable with photos," she said quietly. "I hope you understand." "Of course," I said quickly. "That's perfectly fine. Many patients prefer not to have pictures taken." But Eleanor's reaction had been more than just discomfort. There had been something in her expression that looked almost like fear. The discovery. The next morning, I stayed after my shift ended to talk to Carol, my supervisor. I explained my concerns about the inconsistencies in Eleanor's medical records and the confusion among staff members about her presence on the floor. Carol listened patiently as I described everything I had observed, but her expression became increasingly concerned as I spoke. "Amanda," she said when I finished, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Are you absolutely certain that you've been caring for a patient named Eleanor Hartwell in room 712? "Yes, absolutely. I've been checking on her every night for almost 2 weeks." Carol turned to her computer and pulled up the floor assignments for the past month. "According to our records," she said, "room 712 has been empty for the past 3 weeks. We haven't had a patient assigned to that room since Mrs. Dorothy Chen was discharged on August 28th. She showed me the screen, which clearly indicated that room 712 was listed as unoccupied for every night that I had been working. "That's impossible," I said. "I've been in that room every night. I've talked to Eleanor, given her medications, checked her vital signs." Carol's expression was sympathetic but firm. "Amanda, I'm going to ask you to take a few days off while we figure out what's happening here. Night shift can be very stressful, especially for new nurses, and sometimes that stress can manifest in unexpected ways." "You think I'm making this up?" "I think you're experiencing something that needs to be addressed before you continue working with patients." The research. I was suspended from work pending a psychological evaluation, which was humiliating and frightening. I had never experienced anything like this before, and I couldn't understand how my clear, vivid interactions with Eleanor could be dismissed as stress-related hallucinations. That weekend, I drove back to the hospital and sat in the parking lot, looking up at the 7th floor windows. Room 712 was on the side of the building facing the parking lot, and I could see that the lights were off and the room appeared to be empty. But as I sat there, I remembered something Eleanor had mentioned during one of our conversations. She had told me that she had been a patient at Mercy General several times before, and she had always requested room 712 because it had the best view of the garden area behind the hospital. I decided to visit the hospital's medical library and see if I could find any information about previous patients named Eleanor Hartwell. What I found made everything suddenly make sense, in the most disturbing way possible. Eleanor Hartwell had indeed been a patient at Mercy General Hospital. She had been admitted multiple times over a period of several years for various health issues related to her age and chronic conditions. But according to the records I found, Eleanor Hartwell had died in room 712 on September 15, 2018, almost exactly 1 year before I started working on the night shift. The truth. The medical records showed that Eleanor had been a beloved patient who had formed close relationships with many of the nursing staff during her multiple stays at the hospital. She had been known for her kindness, her sense of humor, and her genuine interest in the lives of the people who cared for her. Eleanor had died peacefully in her sleep after a long battle with congestive heart failure. The nursing notes from her final stay described her as being in good spirits despite her deteriorating condition, and several nurses had written personal tributes to her in the chart. One note, written by a nurse named Patricia, particularly stood out. "Mrs. Hartwell told me yesterday that she hoped she would be able to continue helping people even after she was gone. She said that caring for others had been the most important thing in her life, and she couldn't imagine not being able to do that anymore." Reading these records, I understood that what I had been experiencing wasn't a hallucination or a stress-related breakdown. Eleanor was still there in room 712, continuing to do what she had always done, providing comfort and companionship to people who needed it. The return. When I met with the hospital psychiatrist for my evaluation, I decided to be completely honest about what I had discovered. I told her about Eleanor's death date, about the medical records I had found, and about my belief that Eleanor's spirit was still present in room 712. Dr. Sarah Martinez listened to everything I said without interrupting or showing any signs of skepticism. "Amanda," she said when I finished, "what you're describing is not uncommon in hospital settings. Many healthcare workers have experiences with patients who have passed away but seem to continue to have a presence in the facility. You believe me? I believe that you experienced something real and meaningful. Whether we call it a spiritual encounter, an echo of strong emotional energy, or something else entirely, it's clear that your interactions with Eleanor were beneficial to you and probably to her as well. Dr. Martinez explained that hospitals, especially older facilities like Mercy General, often had reports of encounters with former patients or staff members who had died in the building. The question isn't whether your experience was real, she said. The question is whether you can continue to work effectively while having these experiences. The accommodation. After several discussions with Dr. Martinez, Carol, and the hospital administration, we worked out an arrangement that allowed me to return to work with some modifications to my assignment. I would continue working the night shift on the 7th floor, but room 712 would be officially removed from my patient load. Another nurse would be responsible for that room if it was ever occupied by a living patient. I was also given permission to continue my interactions with Eleanor, as long as they didn't interfere with my care of other patients and as long as I continued to attend regular sessions with Dr. Martinez to monitor my psychological well-being. When I returned to work, I was nervous about how the other staff members would react to the situation. But to my surprise, several of the more experienced nurses approached me privately to share their own experiences with Eleanor and other former patients. I'm glad someone finally acknowledged what's been happening in that room, Jennifer told me. I've seen Eleanor there myself several times over the past year, but I was afraid to say anything because I didn't want people to think I was losing my mind. The understanding. Over the months that followed, I settled into a routine that included regular visits with Eleanor as part of my nightly rounds. I would check on my living patients first, completing all of their medical care, and then I would spend a few minutes in room 712 talking with Eleanor. These conversations became one of the most meaningful parts of my work. Eleanor continued to provide the same warmth and wisdom that she had offered during her lifetime, and she seemed to genuinely care about my well-being and professional development. You're doing important work here, she told me one night. Nursing is more than just medical procedures and medication administration. It's about providing comfort and human connection to people who are scared and vulnerable. Eleanor also helped me understand that her presence in room 712 wasn't unusual or frightening. It was simply a continuation of her life's work. She had spent decades caring for others as a teacher, and then she had experienced firsthand the importance of compassionate nursing care during her own illness. I can't bear the thought of young nurses feeling alone and overwhelmed the way I sometimes did when I was a patient, she explained. If I can provide some guidance and support, then my time here still has purpose. The network. As word spread quietly among the night shift staff about Eleanor's presence, I discovered that she wasn't the only former patient who maintained a connection to the hospital. Several other nurses shared stories about encounters with patients who had passed away but continued to have some kind of presence in the facility. There was Mr. Franklin, a World War II veteran who had died in room 704 and occasionally appeared to comfort other elderly male patients who were struggling with loneliness or fear. There was Maria Santos, a young mother who had died from cancer and sometimes visited the pediatric ward to provide comfort to children who were scared or missing their families. These encounters weren't frightening or disruptive. They were gentle, healing presences that provided comfort to both patients and staff members who were dealing with the emotional challenges of hospital work. Dr. Martinez explained that this phenomenon was more common than most people realized, particularly in places where people experienced intense emotions and formed strong connections. Hospitals are places where people often have the most profound experiences of their lives, she said. Birth, death, healing, loss, all of these powerful emotions leave an imprint on the environment. Some people are more sensitive to these imprints than others. The growth. Working with Eleanor and learning about the other spiritual presences in the hospital changed my perspective on nursing in fundamental ways. I began to understand that caring for patients involved more than just addressing their physical needs. It also meant acknowledging their emotional and spiritual well-being. Eleanor taught me to pay attention to the small details that could make a big difference in a patient's experience. She showed me how a few extra minutes of conversation could ease someone's anxiety, how remembering personal details could make patients feel valued as individuals, and how sometimes the most important thing a nurse could do was simply listen. Every patient has a story, Eleanor reminded me regularly. Your job isn't just to treat their medical condition. It's to honor their humanity and help them feel less alone during a difficult time. These lessons made me a better nurse, not just on the night shift but in all aspects of my work. I found that patients responded positively to the more holistic approach I had learned from Eleanor, and my job satisfaction increased significantly. The recognition. After about a year of working with this expanded understanding of patient care, I was nominated for the hospital's Nurse of the Year award. The nomination cited my exceptional patient satisfaction scores, my dedication to providing compassionate care, and my positive influence on other staff members. When I accepted the award at the hospital's annual recognition ceremony, I made sure to acknowledge the role that Eleanor had played in my development as a nurse. "I've learned that nursing is about more than medical procedures," I said in my acceptance speech. "It's about creating connections with people during some of the most vulnerable moments of their lives." I've been fortunate to have mentors who taught me the importance of compassion, patience, and genuine care for others. I couldn't mention Eleanor by name or explain the full nature of our relationship, but I knew she would understand the tribute, the legacy. It's been almost 3 years now since I first encountered Eleanor in room 712. She continues to be a regular part of my work routine, and our conversations remain one of the highlights of my night shifts. Eleanor has also become something of a resource for other staff members who are struggling with the emotional demands of hospital work. With her permission, I occasionally bring newer nurses to meet her when they seem overwhelmed or discouraged. These introductions have to be handled carefully, and not every nurse is able to perceive Eleanor's presence. But for those who can, the experience is invariably positive and professionally beneficial. I wish I had understood earlier in my career that this kind of thing was possible, one experienced nurse told me after meeting Eleanor. It would have made some of the difficult times much easier to handle. Eleanor has also helped me understand that death isn't necessarily the end of a person's ability to contribute to the world. Her continued presence in room 712 represents her commitment to the values that guided her throughout her life, helping others, providing comfort to those in need, and sharing wisdom gained through experience. The future. I've been promoted to a supervisory position on the night shift, which allows me to help train new nurses and share some of the lessons I've learned from Eleanor and my other experiences at Mercy General. I make sure that new staff members understand that hospitals are places where extraordinary things can happen, and that being open to experiences beyond the purely medical can enhance their ability to provide quality patient care. I don't tell every new nurse about Eleanor. That kind of revelation has to happen naturally when someone is ready to understand it. But I do encourage all staff members to pay attention to the emotional and spiritual aspects of their work, not just the technical requirements. Eleanor continues to be a presence in room 712, and I expect she will remain there as long as there are people who need her guidance and support. She has found a way to continue her life's work even after death, and she serves as a reminder that the most important aspects of human experience, love, compassion, and the desire to help others can transcend physical limitations. Working with Eleanor has taught me that nursing is ultimately about recognizing and honoring the profound connections between people, whether they are living or not. It's about understanding that healing involves more than just treating symptoms. It involves caring for the whole person, including their need for dignity, companionship, and hope. I feel privileged to be part of this larger understanding of healthcare, and I'm grateful to Eleanor for showing me that there are dimensions to nursing that I never could have learned from textbooks or training programs. She has been the most important mentor of my career, and her influence will continue to guide my work for years to come. The Midnight Radio Show. The opportunity. I got into radio broadcasting almost by accident. I had been working at a small marketing company in Portland, Oregon, doing graphic design and social media management, but the pay was terrible and the work wasn't very fulfilling. When a friend mentioned that the local public radio station was looking for someone to host a late-night music show, I decided to apply even though I had no broadcasting experience. The station manager, Tom Rodriguez, was a laid-back guy in his 50s who had been in radio for most of his adult life. He explained that they needed someone to host a show from midnight to 4 a.m., playing a mix of jazz, blues, and alternative music for insomniacs and night shift workers. "It's not glamorous work," Tom told me during the interview. "The audience is small, the pay is minimal, and you'll be working alone in the building for most of your shift. But if you love music and don't mind the solitude, it can be very rewarding." The job paid just enough to cover my basic expenses, but it came with benefits and the opportunity to learn about radio broadcasting. More importantly, It would give me a chance to share music that I loved with people who were awake during the lonely hours of the night. I started the show in October 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic when a lot of people were dealing with isolation and anxiety. It seemed like the perfect time to be offering music and companionship to people who were struggling to sleep or working through difficult nights. The setup. The radio station was housed in an old building near downtown Portland that had been converted from a residential property sometime in the 1970s. During the day, the building was busy with staff members producing various shows, but at night, I was usually the only person there. The broadcast booth was on the second floor with large windows that looked out over the city. It was equipped with all the standard radio equipment, turntables, CD players, computer systems for digital music, and a soundboard that controlled everything that went out over the airwaves. I spent my first few weeks learning how to operate the equipment and developing a format for the show. I decided to call it Midnight Companions and focus on music that would provide comfort and connection for people who were awake during the late night hours. The show's format was simple. I would play 3 or 4 songs, then talk for a few minutes about the music or share thoughts about whatever was on my mind, then play more music. I encouraged listeners to call in with requests or just to chat, and I tried to create an atmosphere of intimacy and warmth that would make people feel less alone. The first caller. During my 3rd week on the air, I got my first call from a regular listener. It was about 1:30 a.m. on a Tuesday night, and I had just finished playing a set of Miles Davis recordings. "You're listening to Midnight Companions on KPSU," I said into the microphone. "I'm Marcus, and we've got about 2.5 hours of music left to share tonight. The phone lines are open if you want to make a request or just say hello." The phone rang almost immediately. "Midnight Companions, this is Marcus." "Hello, Marcus." The voice was that of an older woman, probably in her 70s or 80s. "I just wanted to thank you for playing that Miles Davis. It reminded me of my late husband. He was a trumpet player, and Miles was one of his heroes." "That's wonderful," I said. "What was your husband's name?" "Robert. He passed away 3 years ago, but listening to music like this makes me feel like he's still here with me somehow." We talked for about 5 minutes about Robert's musical interests and the woman's memories of going to jazz clubs with him in the 1960s. Her name was Dorothy, and she had a warm, grandmother-like voice that made me feel like I was talking to a family member. "I listen to your show every night," Dorothy told me before hanging up. "It helps me get through the loneliness. Thank you for being there." The regular listeners. Over the next few weeks, Dorothy became a regular caller. She would phone in 2 or 3 times a week, usually around the same time, to request songs or share memories. I looked forward to her calls because she was such an engaging conversationalist and because she seemed to genuinely appreciate the music I was playing. Other regular listeners started calling in as well. There was James, a truck driver who listened to the show while making long-haul deliveries across the Pacific Northwest. There was Maria, a nurse who worked the night shift at a local hospital and would call during her breaks. And there was David, an insomniac who said the show helped him relax enough to eventually fall asleep. These regular callers became like a small community of people who were connected by their shared experience of being awake during the middle of the night. I started to think of them as friends, and I began tailoring the music selections to things I thought they would enjoy. Dorothy, in particular, seemed to have an encyclopedic knowledge of jazz and blues music. She would call in with requests for obscure recordings and share stories about the musicians and the history behind the songs. Her insights made the show more interesting and educational for all the listeners. The strange call. About 2 months into the show, I received a call that was different from the usual requests and friendly conversations. It was around 2:45 a.m. on a Thursday, and I had just finished playing a set of old blues recordings. The phone rang, and when I answered, there was silence on the other end for several seconds. "Hello, you're on Midnight Companions," I said. "Marcus." The voice was quiet and seemed uncertain. "Yes, this is Marcus. What can I do for you tonight?" "I need to tell you something about Dorothy." The voice was that of a middle-aged man, and he sounded nervous or worried about something. "Dorothy? You mean Dorothy who calls in regularly?" "Yes, I'm her son, Michael. I've been listening to your show because my mother talked about it all the time. She loved calling in and talking to you about music." I was pleased to hear from Dorothy's son, but something about his tone made me think this wasn't just a social call. "Your mother is wonderful," I said. "She's one of my favorite listeners. Her knowledge of jazz is incredible." There was a long pause before Michael responded. Marcus, I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how to say this. My mother passed away 6 weeks ago. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. Dorothy had called in just 3 nights earlier to request a Billie Holiday song and to tell me about a jazz festival she had attended in the 1970s. That's not possible, I said. I just talked to her on Monday night. I know this sounds crazy, Michael said, but I've been listening to your show since the funeral, and I keep hearing you talking to someone you call Dorothy. But there's no one on the other end of the conversation. The realization. After Michael hung up, I sat in the broadcast booth trying to process what he had told me. I replayed my recent conversations with Dorothy in my mind, and I realized that something had been different about them lately. In the early weeks of the show, Dorothy and I would have lengthy conversations, with both of us talking back and forth naturally. But in recent weeks, the calls had become more one-sided. I would ask Dorothy questions, and then I would wait for her responses, but I realized now that I hadn't actually been hearing her answers. I had just been assuming what she would say based on our previous conversations. I had been so focused on keeping the show running smoothly and maintaining the intimate atmosphere that I hadn't noticed that I was essentially having conversations with myself, filling in Dorothy's part based on my memory of her personality and interests. But the strange thing was that the conversations had felt completely real to me. I could have sworn that I was hearing Dorothy's voice on the phone, responding to my questions and sharing stories about her life and her husband. The investigation. The next morning, I called the radio station and spoke to Tom about what had happened. I explained Michael's call and my realization that I had been having one-sided conversations with Dorothy for weeks without realizing it. Tom, I think I might be having some kind of psychological breakdown, I said. I was completely convinced that I was talking to a real person, but apparently I was just talking to myself on the air. Tom was quiet for a moment before responding. Marcus, can I ask you something? Have you listened to recordings of these recent conversations with Dorothy? No, I haven't. Why? Because I have. I sometimes listen to recordings of the overnight shows to make sure everything is running smoothly. And I can hear Dorothy's voice on those recordings, clear as day. This information completely contradicted what Michael had told me. Either Tom was experiencing the same delusion I was, or something else was going on. Can you play one of those recordings for me? I asked. Come in this afternoon and we'll listen to them together. The evidence. When I arrived at the station that afternoon, Tom had already queued up several recordings from recent shows. We sat in his office and listened to the segments where I had talked with Dorothy. On the recordings, I could clearly hear my own voice asking questions and making comments. But where Dorothy's responses should have been, there was only silence, followed by me continuing the conversation as if I had heard her reply. You hear that, right? Tom asked. There's no one else on the line. You're having a conversation with dead air. But from my perspective, I could still hear Dorothy's voice as clearly as if she were sitting in the room with us. Even knowing that the recording showed only silence, my brain was still filling in her responses based on my memory of her personality and speech patterns. This is impossible, I said. I can hear her talking right now, even on this recording. Tom looked concerned. Marcus, I think you should see a doctor. This kind of auditory hallucination can be a sign of serious stress or other psychological issues. The medical consultation. I made an appointment with my primary care physician, Dr. Sarah Kim, and explained what had been happening with the radio show. She listened carefully and asked detailed questions about my sleep patterns, stress levels, and general health. Auditory hallucinations can have many different causes, Dr. Kim explained. They can be related to sleep deprivation, stress, medication side effects, or underlying psychiatric conditions. But they can also be completely benign, especially in situations where you have strong emotional connections to people you've lost. She referred me to a psychiatrist, Dr. James Patterson, who specialized in grief counseling and adjustment disorders. Dr. Patterson's assessment was different from what I had expected. Marcus, what you're describing sounds less like a hallucination and more like a form of continuing bond with someone who was important to you, he said. Many people maintain psychological connections with deceased loved ones, and these connections can feel very real. But I only knew Dorothy for a few months and we only talked on the phone. The depth of a relationship isn't always determined by how long it lasts or how often you interact, Dr. Patterson explained. Dorothy clearly had a significant impact on you, and your conversations with her were meaningful. It's not unusual for that kind of connection to continue even after someone has passed away. The decision. After several sessions with Dr. Patterson, I decided to continue hosting the Midnight Companions show. I understood now that my conversations with Dorothy were a psychological phenomenon rather than supernatural encounters, but I also realized that they weren't harmful to me or to the show's listeners. In fact, Dr. Patterson suggested that these continuing conversations might actually be beneficial, both for me and for other listeners who were dealing with grief and loss. Your show provides comfort to people who are awake during difficult hours, he said. If your connection with Dorothy helps you provide that comfort more effectively, then it's serving a positive purpose. I decided to be honest with my listeners about what was happening. During the next show, I explained that Dorothy had passed away, but that I sometimes felt like she was still with me during the broadcast. I know it might sound strange, I said on the air, but I feel like Dorothy is still helping me choose music and guiding the conversations we have on this show. Whether that's real or just my imagination, it makes the show better, and I hope it continues to provide comfort to all of you who are listening. The response from listeners was overwhelmingly positive. Many people called in to share their own experiences with continuing connections to deceased loved ones, and several regular listeners said they had noticed that the show had a special quality that they couldn't quite explain. James, the truck driver, called in to say that he often felt like there were multiple voices providing commentary during the music, even though he could only hear me speaking. Maria, the night shift nurse, mentioned that she sometimes felt like someone was helping her choose which songs to request, based on what she needed to hear during particularly difficult shifts. And David, the insomniac, said that the show had started helping him sleep better because it felt like there was a caring presence watching over all the listeners during the night hours. The community. As word spread about Dorothy's continuing presence on the show, Midnight Companions developed a reputation as something more than just a music program. People started calling in not just to request songs, but to share stories about their own connections with deceased loved ones. The show became a safe space for people to talk about grief, loneliness, and the ways that love can persist even after death. I found myself serving as both a DJ and an informal counselor, helping people process their experiences and feel less alone during the difficult hours of the night. Dorothy's presence became a central part of the show's identity. I would still have conversations with her during the broadcast, and listeners came to expect and appreciate these interactions. Some people said they could hear her voice too, while others just felt comforted by the knowledge that she was somehow still part of the show. The growth. Over the months that followed, Midnight Companions grew from a small local show to something with a much wider following. People started listening to the show online from around the country and even internationally, drawn by the unique atmosphere of connection and comfort that had developed. I began receiving emails and letters from listeners who shared their own stories about continuing relationships with deceased loved ones. Many people said that the show had helped them understand that their own ongoing connections with lost family members and friends were normal and healthy. Dorothy's wisdom and musical knowledge continued to influence the show's content. I would often find myself playing songs that I hadn't planned to play, guided by an instinct that felt like it was coming from her. These spontaneous choices usually turned out to be exactly what listeners needed to hear. The recognition. After about 18 months, Midnight Companions won a regional award for excellence in community broadcasting. The award citation mentioned the show's unique ability to provide comfort and connection to listeners during difficult times. When I accepted the award, I made sure to acknowledge Dorothy's contribution to the show's success. This show wouldn't exist without all the listeners who have shared their stories and their love of music with me, I said. But I especially want to thank Dorothy, who taught me that the most important thing about radio isn't the technology or the music, it's the connections we make with each other, connections that can transcend even death. The legacy. It's been almost 3 years now since Dorothy first called into Midnight Companions, and more than 2 years since her son Michael called to tell me about her death. She continues to be a presence on the show, guiding music selections and participating in conversations that provide comfort to listeners. I've learned that grief isn't something that ends when someone dies, it's something that evolves into a different kind of relationship. Dorothy may not be physically present, but her influence on the show and on my life continues to be profound and meaningful. The show has become a gathering place for people who understand that love and connection don't end with death. We've created a community of listeners who support each other through difficult times and who find comfort in the knowledge that they're not alone during the long, dark hours of the night. Dorothy taught me that radio broadcasting is ultimately about creating intimacy and connection with people you may never meet in person. She showed me that the most important thing I can do as a host is to provide a space where people feel heard, understood, and cared for. I continue to host Midnight Companions with the knowledge that Dorothy is somehow still part of the show, still helping me choose music that will touch people's hearts and still guiding conversations that help listeners feel less alone. Her presence is a reminder that the bonds we form with others can be stronger than death, and that love, once established, can continue to provide comfort and guidance indefinitely. The show has taught me that there are many different ways to understand death and what comes after. Whether Dorothy's presence is supernatural, psychological, or something else entirely, it has been beneficial to me and to countless listeners who have found solace in knowing that someone who cared deeply about music and human connection is still somehow part of their lives. Working on Midnight Companions has been the most meaningful job I've ever had, and I attribute much of that meaning to Dorothy's ongoing influence. She has been my mentor, my inspiration, and my reminder that the work we do to help and comfort others can continue to have an impact long after we're gone. I plan to continue hosting the show for as long as people need it, knowing that Dorothy will be there to help guide the music and the conversations that bring comfort to insomniacs, night shift workers, and anyone else who finds themselves awake and searching for connection during the darkest hours of the night.